melhor cada quer trazer uma área, tá? Quer começar?
Por exemplo, quando eu digo this is really object of thought he recommends the theory of 2023 items in case of things. And I was like, you don't do my relationship. Yes, I think this is just to say, like, don't take it down, like, so, not that I could do, but I was like, that can't be a general public class, because the entire world. It's basically like these rules are highly project specific, even if it's like something you think is like humans in the room, what is best, like.
And sustainability issues, particular conditioning, even higher the temperature below specific limits. That's fascinating. And
Tem certeza que você já ouviu falar? Também já
Não, para passar lá.
na máquina de lava. Não funciona. Se botar na
Pode começar? Pega o de qualquer forma, a gente tem alguns microfones aqui, então pode começar aqui. Oi? All right, so we are starting. We don't need to use the microphone because we have mics here and here. So when you are here and you are presenting, try to be loud so that the mic will be able to capture your sound. We are almost ready to start this workshop on AI sovereignty and AI regulation, and we will have two parts of the workshop. The first session dedicated to AI sovereignty, exploring a little bit of the research we are doing and why we are speaking about AI sovereignty, to what extent this is relevant for AI regulation. And then we are going to discuss various models of AI regulation, thanks to our very distinguished guests that are here with us. The first session will be basically a byproduct of our CyberBRICS project. So let me start the presentation introducing a little bit of the project, those of you that don't know it yet. It's a project that we have created here 7 years ago. The first part of the project aimed at analyzing cybersecurity and data governance issues in the BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Then we moved into digital transformation and internet access, and currently we are analyzing AI governance and AI industrial policy. And this last phase is what we brand as AI sovereignty, right? So as you will see, most of our team is here. We have fellows that are here from 6 to 12 months per year. Some of them are here with us that will speak in the first session. We have Aifang Ma from China, Pra from India, Nombulelo Lekota from South Africa, and last but not least, Viviane Costa here from Brazil. Our Russian fellow is currently in the US, but if you are here next month for CPTP Latam, you will meet him then in Turin. Now, and we will have more at the end of the years. Now, why I'm spending so much time speaking about this? Because this is how we also got a nice website with all the information I'm mentioning in open access, including the team and the publications. The first time that we started to work about the digital sovereignty was thanks to this initial study on cyber security in the BRICS. And the concluding chapter of this book was precisely about how BRICS countries are going to build digital sovereignty. Because 5 or 6 years ago, when we started doing the research, analyzing cybersecurity, we noticed that there was a sort of overlap between the narratives and policies and initiatives linked to cybersecurity and those linked to digital sovereignty in terms of control, but not only in terms of control. And that is the most intriguing part. So that is something that we also included in this book that was quite influential here last year, because it advocated to have a systemic vision to cybersecurity and even to build a multi-stakeholder body to be able to understand all the different dimensions of cybersecurity and build digital sovereignty in the country. And it has strongly inspired the development of the new organ of the Presidency of the Republic, this Brazilian National Council on Cybersecurity, of which I'm the honor of being a member since February, that aims precisely at putting together different parts of the government with different parts of civil society, academia, and the private sector to understand how to build cybersecurity and being digitally sovereign. Now, what we understand as digitally sovereign, being digitally sovereign or digital sovereignty is the capability to understand the technology, develop the technology, and regulate the technology. Now, this, of course, if you are an authoritarian regime, may mean that you use technology for social control and to monitor people and to influence people. But if you are not, if you are a democracy, it means that you want to understand the technology, develop the technology for developmental purposes, and regulate it according to your own values. So there is nothing controversial about it. It's actually, it's interesting because when we were analyzing the first phase of the project, the narratives about digital sovereignty, in 2020, there was the first inaugural speech of Ursula von der Leyen in Europe, where she started to speak about technological sovereignty. And it was interesting because until that moment, the only ones that spoke about digital or cyber sovereignty were China and India. And then, and so digital sovereignty was considered something for authoritarian regimes. And then when Ursula von der Leyen started to speak about it, then all of a sudden, digital sovereignty became something for democracies. And so our study proved it actually is not black and white. There are several nuances, and it's like speaking about government. Could be the one that snoops into your life and monitors you, but can also be the one that provides you public services that you need. And so it's not really about the label, but it's about what's behind the label, right? And so it is essential for, if you consider it as the capacity to understand technology, develop it, and regulate it, it's essential for the full enjoyment of the right to self-determination, which is a fundamental right that everyone has, right? I presented about this when Nathalie invited me at the very good conference she organized in February. And it is also essential to achieve what the Europeans call strategic autonomy, the concept very dear to Macron or Ursula von der Leyen, indeed. Now, last year, I published this paper on good digital sovereignty, especially stressing that there are very good examples from rich countries, from Brazil and India. There are some very good examples, and also South Africa, of how digital public infrastructures are a good example of building a good digital sovereignty. For those of you who are here, live here, or visiting us, I'm sure you have already heard about PIX, our digital infrastructure for online payment system. Before we built this, the only way in Brazil, as in the rest of the global south, most of the global south, I would say, to do online payment for consumers was to use Visa and MasterCard circuits. They charge 3% per month, and besides this extortionary fee, someone might say, they also collect data, personal data about everyone. So that their value is not the 3% that they actually have to share with the banks. It's the personal data they collect, and they have a duopoly about this around the world. And this duopoly has been broken for the first time in Brazil thanks to a digital public infrastructure PIX that puts together the country in control of the data that are produced. And so the data is not only used for profiling purposes, it's used to build all the intelligence, not only the artificial intelligence, but also the innovation that you can develop thanks to the collection and processing of data. And actually, it's interesting to see that Brazil did this because it copied from India, from UPI, the Uniform Payment Infrastructure. So India as well has a digital public infrastructure for payment. And what is interesting is that India introduced this in 2016, copying from Russia. Russia has a digital public infrastructure. It's not exactly the same thing. It's called MIR. They adopted it when they first invaded Crimea in 2014. And the first sanction was cutting them out of Visa and MasterCard circuits. So if you are Russian, the day after the invasion of Crimea, basically, you could not pay anything with your Visa and MasterCard card. So the Russian government built MIR, which is a 20th century digital public infrastructure because it relies on a physical support, on a card. Now, the great innovation of Indians and Brazilians was first to understand that actually this measure that was created by the Russians for survival was actually very good to break this duopoly of Visa and MasterCard. But then they upgraded it, because why use a card when you can have software? So UPI or PIX are total software. And I think that the Brazilians even upgraded the Indian version, because the Indian version, so the way of Indians to build digital public infrastructures is to delegate it to non-for-profit entities that work for the government, but they are not government. It's not like here where the PIX is created by the Brazilian central bank, and it's implemented by the private sector, but the control is in the Brazilian central bank. So if you want to have answers, to have a freedom of access, an access to information request, you can address it to a public government, and they need to reply to it because they are obliged to it. In India, they are not, because it is called public because everyone can use it, public, but it's not governed by the public. So if you want to know how is the code, who is using the data, how it is handled, you cannot know it. Basically, it's a huge black box because it is a private foundation that controls it. And then digital commons, something very interesting from Brazil and India, and also South Africa, which will have the G20 presidency after Brazil this year, in India last year, is the creation of a lot of community networks, which are this crowdsourced infrastructure to expand internet access. And this is something that I've been working for the past years, which is a very good example of digital sovereignty from a community-based perspective. So last year, we also published this booklet that we launched at the IGF, precisely mapping some of these experiences and showing how when people that are not connected, disconnected, I have the opportunity to create their own technology, to understand the technology, and to self-regulate it. They become digitally sovereign. They are much more sovereign than other people using other types of technology to connect. So there are very good examples of how digital sovereignty is not only something that the government plans, it's something that actually people, individuals, communities can do. So there are a lot of different examples that we track in the book that will be released at the end of the year in November with the Cambridge University Press, Digital Sovereignty from the BRICS. You also can find the introduction and conclusion in free access on the website. And then we arrive here to the core of our presentation. I promise I will deliver it in 3 minutes that I have still. So what is the digital AI sovereignty? Sorry, based on what we have discussed before, it's really the capacity of a country, but you can also say of an individual, of a community, to understand the technology, the AI technology, develop it and regulate it. And again, there is nothing controversial about it. It's the way you implement this that may be controversial, not. It's a way of expressing agency, self-determination, and control over technology, right? Nothing controversial about this. Last year, when I wrote for the first time about this in this paper that was published by Carnegie Endowment, I analyzed the case of Brazil to see in practice how this works and which are the elements that can make you digital AI sovereign or not. So this actually, there is an extended version of this paper that on this book that was launched in the preliminary version last year, the IGF, and will be published by the end of the year, hopefully by Springer. And so this is what I call the AI sovereignty stack. And that is what I read at the core of my presentation is my last slide, but one, there is still a surprise. And so my point here is that if you want to be sovereign, so I'm sure we will discuss mainly in the second section of today's workshop is this part here, this element, risk-based regulation, is what the EU is putting forward, what the Congress in Brazil is discussing, which is essential, but is only one of the elements. Because if you can regulate risk, but you cannot develop the technology, in my personal opinion, it's useless to have the risk-based regulation because you still keep on being a digital colony, an AI colony. And so even if you have a very good regulation, you cannot really apply it. What is essential is to have research development and regulation in all these 8 elements, key AI sovereignty enablers, So data, or be it personal data or not, you have to understand how data are collected, be able to develop technology that allows you to harvest and process data and regulate it, of course. Software algorithm and models, when they are more complex, again, you have to be able to research and develop it and control it. Actually, and a good example that we put in the book on digital sovereignty from the BRICS about software is the fact that few people know that Brazil actually was a pioneer in digital sovereignty without even knowing it. In the first Lula administration in 2003, Brazil adopted open software, free and open software for the administration as national policy. And this was reverted in 2016 by the Temer administration. But Brazil was the first country in the world to adopt free and open software for the administration, meaning that it was the vision at the time, very pioneering vision of President Lula at the time, to understand that if you adopt open software, you are free from dependency. And but tragically, it has not been nurtured, and then it has been reversed. Then computational capacity, I'm sure that Jai will speak a lot about it because she's our expert. Needless to say that almost everyone in the world at this point with doing AI depends on AWS, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure that concentrates 70% of the market. So if you don't develop computational capacity, you are not sovereign. Meaningful connectivity is a very important point. I've mentioned before an example of how connectivity can be driven by digital sovereignty. What we have in most of the global south is exactly the opposite. If you are here in Brazil, you will notice that you have free social media of the Meta group, so Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, and all the rest you have to pay for it. So whichever contract you have with your mobile internet access provider, you will have for free social media and a few other apps. So this so-called zero rating model. So some applications are subsidized, but all the rest is you have to pay for it. And in a country like almost all the entire global south, where most of the people are poor, this means that most of the people, actually there is a very good study by CETIC that was released 2 months ago, 78% of the people in Brazil do not have what is called meaningful connectivity. 22% of the population, they have access to everything. 78% they have access to social media. And then they have to pay dearly if they want to access the rest. What does it mean in practice? They are mere consumers. They will never be able to produce and share AI. And even if they produce and share it, no one will use it because everyone can use for free social media, but no one will use for, everyone has to pay to use any Brazilian innovation. Electrical power, this usually when I say this to our northern hemisphere friends, they are like, electrical power, because they are not used to have shortages and blackouts, but it is a common practice in global south. Nombulelo will speak maybe about this in South Africa. If you don't have reliable power, you cannot do AI. And if you don't have sustainable ways of managing electrical power and water, you run a totally unsustainable AI infrastructure. Digital literacy, well, this is self-explanatory. If you want to produce it, you have to understand it. Cybersecurity as well. Risk-based regulation, again, I want to stress that I have nothing against risk-based regulation, and I think it is essential to have it. But I'm very much against only speaking about this because we run the risk of looking at the finger and missing the forest if you only speak about this. We published an op-ed in O Globo in page 3, published on Sunday, so prime time, 1 month ago to explain this, and this had a very good impact even with policymakers. So I hope that there will be more interest on these issues, especially because the current government is very much in favor of this kind of thinking. These are some reading suggestions of what will be published in the coming months. The book I mentioned, the other book that I mentioned, and also a special issue on digital transformations in the BRICS country. And then we have more upcoming with our current phase, but it will be next year. This is the concluding chapter of the book in free access on the website. And that's all, folks. Thank you very much. And now we can have a very directed vision into how some of the BRICS countries are thinking about this in practice, because we have the great pleasure of having here some brilliant people from the BRICS countries that are very good expertise in some of the areas that I was mentioning before, very different backgrounds, and are mapping this here we can even take this all out to the presentation. Okay. They are mapping. They are using this 8 AI sovereignty enabler framework to understand how this works in the various countries and to have the mapping based on which we are then producing more research. Shall we start with Aifang? Yes. If you want, I can leave here my remote
Okay.
control. Yes.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much, Luca. I think I'm truly impressed by the work already realized in this CyberBRICS project. Due to the time limits, I will directly go to the geopoliticization part. Well, when we talk about the sovereignty, I think it's related to the states. So what I'm talking today is actually to talk about the impact of this geopoliticization of the digital economy on the way in which China is regulating the AI. So first thing is I wanted to talk a bit about this geopoliticization of the digital economy. When the internet firstly appeared, everybody is talking about the fact that the internet is going to create a kind of a borderless world. Yeah. But after 30 years of development today, what we see is this dystopia about this potential. Actually, the appearance of this geopoliticization tendency has two backgrounds. So the first background is the surveillance capitalism. So to show how the states is necessary is an important actor for the even in this digital age. So I think everybody is familiar with the work by Smuha, who is a professor at the law school at Harvard University. So the surveillance capitalism explains the fact that people today actually are becoming kind of disappropriated by the large digital platforms because today the data are the raw materials which support this digital economy. So in this case, since the people are kind of are disadvantaged in these power relations with the platforms, so we need the state to protect the citizens. So this is the first factor which shows that the necessity of the states in the digital age. And the second background is the digital neo-mercantilism. So the mercantilism is a term which is used by Adam Smith for the first time. So the digital neo-mercantilism actually describes the close linkage between the activities of the large platforms and then the states. So the platforms are not free, so their activities for the internationalization are closely related to the security of the country. And then this is what the Chinese communication scholar Qiu Chuan talks about the return of the realism. So with this tendency, we actually see the rising importance of the states. So even in this digital age, Qiu Chuan gives a definition about what the geopoliticization is. So the geopoliticization is actually the process by which the platforms are becoming territorialized. So the geopolitical borders becoming the fault lines of the confrontation. So here I give you one example. So about how these large platforms are actually serving the interest of the big states, like in the war between Russia and Ukraine. So Google actually provides the high definition satellite images of all the military and strategic infrastructures in Russia. And then it does not provide these high definition images about restaurants or shops, these highly frequented places in Ukraine. So actually Google also serves the interest of the American government. So now I wanted to explain so how this geopoliticization is actually applied to the way to the regulation of AI. Here I wanted to talk about the two types of pressures facing the Chinese government. The first pressure is this competitive pressure from the USA. So here I give a timeline of all these major regulations that so the red is for China and the green for the USA. You can see that from 2015, so when China released the Made in China strategy for the first time, then you can see kind of a tit for tat ring between these two countries for releasing the AI strategies. So in 2016, the White House actually released 3 AI strategies, and then in China, so China reacted to this strategy and by releasing the National Development Plan for Next Generation AI. So until 2020, there is another type of pressure which appears. All right. So now you can see after 2020, so the USA continues to be the source of the competitive pressure for China. And then, especially after the war between Ukraine and Russia, because this war shows that Russia has quite a lot of weaknesses in terms of its military equipment, its strategies for the war. And then the USA actually adjusted, so modified its national security strategy by saying that, well, by saying that the PRC is actually the only competitor with both the intent to shift the international order and increasingly with these powers to reshape the international order. So this is an important pressure coming out with this geopoliticization, And here you can see all these big strategies that the American government has taken so to kind of to fight against China. So starting with this Clean Path initiative, in which actually the USA pressured the EU by saying that, well, you should not, we the America, we don't use the equipment by Huawei, and then the European guys, you should not use it to ensure the security of the communication between the USA and its embassies in the EU. And then there is also the Chips and Science Act in 2022. Actually, the USA provides almost $50 billion to the industries of the semiconductor by saying that, well, if you wanted to get our subsidies, then you should promise not to build the chips, the mature node chips factories in China. And then the BIS actually from 2022 until this year continues to release these export controls, which produces quite a lot of pressure for China. So this is the competitive pressure. And and then there is the institutional pressure from the EU. I think that everybody knows this, the Brussels effect, which is actually put forward by Brett Ford from Columbia University. So the Brussels effect is actually, it means this capacity of the EU to single-handedly to shape the regulation of the digital economy, because it has shown that each time the EU is able to put forward the very innovative regulation methods for the digital economy. So here I give you one example of the GDPR. So the GDPR, we know that it kind of advances the right to be forgotten and also the data portability, and then it produces quite a lot of imitation effects in other countries. You can see that in South Korea, in New Zealand, in South Africa, in Switzerland, and also in China. So everybody learns from the GDPR. So even in the Personal Information Protection Law of China, the Article 45 actually also imitated the GDPR by inserting the right to data portability. So how to react to these two types of pressure? So actually, so China now has a dual track AI regulation. So at the national level, so the regulation is actually both a facilitative regulation and a restrictive regulation. And then at the local level, it is mainly this facilitative regulation, so to make the AI regulation easier. So now I want to show, especially for this national level, you can see at the national level, there are actually two types of regulators. So you have the CAC, which stands for the Cyberspace Administration of China. So this is the administration which kind of rolls out the standards and also the cybersecurity rules. So plays a role of this restrictive regulation. So to kind of innovate in the regulation thing. And then you have the NDRC, the Ministry of Science and Technology, and then the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. They are kind of releasing the facilitative regulations. Yeah, sorry, thank you. So here I give you kind of a timeline which shows how this dual track regulation is working. You can see that so the red is actually for this the national level regulation. So actually at the national level, so the objectives of the regulation is both to set up to innovate in the regulation of the technology and also for facilitate the technology innovation. And then at the local level, in the green color, the main objective of the local regulations is actually to push, to facilitate the AI, to facilitate the technology innovation in AI. So they have this dual track regulation which goes on hand in hand. Thank you so much. So the achievements of China in the AI application is really how to say, especially in the recent years, is truly impressive. So here I want to give you some examples. So these are the pictures that I take when I do the field research in the Shougang group, so which is a state-owned steel firm there. So you can see here, so this is a taxi stop, and this is for the robot run. So here people stay there, and then you call a driverless taxi, and then this taxi comes. There is someone inside the car, but this one. So this person is only there to ensure security. He does not drive himself. And then we also have kind of this clean robot, which is very complex in the Chinese supermarkets. So this is also the result of this dual track regulation due to the investment by local governments. So now I wanted to give you another example. So this is the interview materials that I collected in Beijing. So actually, the geopoliticization produces two types of pressures for China. So on the first hand, they have to innovate for the technology innovation, but on the other hand, we should also compete with the EU to roll out new types of the regulation methods. So now this guy, so this is a very famous lawyer in China. So he gives this metaphor, which I find truly interesting, even though it's a bit exaggerated. So the digital economy for China is the heart of the economy. Because in China, if you don't run the WeChat or the WeChat, you are totally disconnected from the world because you cannot you cannot pay. And actually, quite a lot of young Chinese people like me, we don't know where is the nearest supermarket is because we buy everything online. But for the EU, I actually studied in France for 7 years. So the connection, the embeddedness of the digital economy and the AI into people's daily life is still that much. So he used this metaphor, the heart and the hair, so to explain why there is this differences in the regulation approach. So now to conclude, there is kind of a diversification of the factors which can influence the outcomes of the geopolitical competition. So actually, as I said, the institutional pressure and the capacity pressure, so both of them actually play a role so to influence whether this country can fare well in the geopolitical competition. So due to these two types of pressure, actually, the regulation of AI in China is characterized by the coexistence of this facilitative regulation and the restrictive regulation. And then you have this the draw track regulation to kind of simultaneously reply to these two regulations, to these two types of pressures. Okay, I think I overrun the time. So these are the references, and all your questions are welcome.
So very good. Do you want to have maybe if you have some question at the end, so we have all the presentation, as we have started with some delay. Shall we go directly to Jai? Thank you very much. I found excellent presentation. Please, Jai, the floor is yours. I'm sure there will be some comments from our European friends on the metaphor on the regulation by happening. Yeah.
Hi, it's an interesting time to do this presentation about India because we've just had elections and there is a new government, so it's a bit unclear about what if the new government's policies are going to be like. Potentially a lot like the old government, but it's unclear if the Ministry of Electronics and IT will be retained under the BJP or if it will be with an alliance partner. So there might be changes or there might not. So this is something to keep in mind. There have been, since the explosion of foundation models in AI with the large language models that were released, there have been market developments in India. There have been so-called indigenous models that have been released, but these have rarely been built from scratch. They've been built on top of existing American models. And under the previous government, there were huge policy announcements, just as it was their term was beginning to end. So the India AI mission with the huge outlay, it's quite interesting that it has many components in terms of building AI capacities in India, not necessarily sovereignty. And what has happened with the fact that the BJP does not have absolute majority in this government is that parliamentary committees might matter again after 10 years, which is very interesting. So that's another sort of avenue to look at when you track India in the next few years. So I'm just going to talk about a few sort of ingredients or like AI sovereignty enablers, like Professor Luca said, to think about what AI sovereignty might look like in India. And data, of course, is an important keyword. India, as you might have seen, has been sort of a thought leader in terms of how to govern data, thinking about community governance, community ownership of data, data cooperatives, digital public infrastructure, the concept itself of non-personal data and governing it differently from personal data. So a lot of these ideas have actually come from India, not always from the government, but from civil society and academia and so on. But they have rarely sort of translated into actual laws and policies, sometimes here and there in e-commerce and so on, but not necessarily always. So the personal data protection law that India finally has after so many years is quite a watered down version of what was originally proposed, which was quite innovative and comprehensive and could have been a game changer. But of course, there was lobbying. And there was supposed to be an India Data Management Office, but it's unclear to me what happened with it. There is the India AI mission, which, I mean, I don't think it's uninspiring, so that places it from, but it's interesting and we'll talk more about it. The actually interesting things that have come out of India are socio-technical solutions like digital public infrastructure. For instance, for data, there's consent managers and account aggregators, sort of intermediaries that will allow individuals to control how their data is used, especially in the financial sector. It's interesting because, Luca, you asked this question in all the questions we had about how to look at this in AI sovereignty enablers. And the census has not been conducted. It was supposed to be conducted in 2021. And for various political reasons, it has not. So we don't have that base level of reliable data for India at this moment. When we come to algorithms, it's concerning that there is no concrete and coherent policy for algorithm, like the governance of algorithms in India. And it's doubly concerning because there have been plenty of algorithmic harms in India. A lot of them emerged in India in various global south contexts that I know about India. So things like the algorithmic management of the workplace, whether that's a gig platform or it's just your normal workplace that is like an IT office, but there's a lot of algorithmic management that happens and there's absolutely no regulation for this sort of thing. In fact, there is deregulation with the new labor codes. There are vague suggestions of risk-based regulation in the draft Digital India Act, but again, no one knows what happened to that draft and whether this act is going to come. And in the India AI mission, there is this strategic perspective of what to do about algorithms and algorithms in the sense of models. So they're thinking of promoting large multimodal models and domain-specific models in very critical sectors, but there's no publicly available details beyond that. And it's also a bit unclear why these two are just, I mean, I can understand why critical sectors. It's perhaps it was quite reactive, the first choice to what was happening in global markets. In terms of compute, there is very active engagement from the government, from the specific minister, but also in general, there is like this very directed and strategic thinking in terms of compute for AI in India. As far as I can tell, there are dual goals of manufacturing value add and sovereignty, less of the latter, more of the former. And by the former, I just mean like India's economic growth in the last several years has been extraordinarily jobless. So it's important that the government thinks about bringing in industry to India. They've tried to do it through the Make in India scheme. It hasn't been very successful. So they've been thinking that in the way that India brought in a lot of IT jobs, during the Y2K crisis and as these things were developing, they're thinking now that with the advent of AI, perhaps semiconductor design and manufacturing and general like chip making can be this new sort of area where India makes its mark in the supply chain of technology globally. So that I think is driving more of this than the idea of sovereignty, although the latter is present. The India AI mission, which is like this huge scheme that I talked about, with a huge outlay, has plans to build a 10,000 GPU cluster in India. The chips are not domestically manufactured, but they're planned to be in India. But again, like I said, there is a lot of talk. There was an earlier plan of having a 25,000 GPU cluster, a national supercomputer, but it's unclear what happened to those plans, if that is the same plan that has been reduced at the moment. So we don't know. And also there's a plan to provide compute as a service to startups. from the government. So that's as much as it's therefore like very concrete the provision of compute, but there are incentive schemes for the design and manufacture of semiconductors. So there's a design-linked incentive scheme for design and production-linked incentive scheme for the production of semiconductors. And the design scheme has been more successful because India has a sort of base of the design of various components for semiconductors. But a lot of this value usually accrues to multinational corporations. So even though a lot of the design happens in India, it's not the highest value capturing component. So there is some thinking in terms of how to change this, but it's obviously hard to, because it's such a proprietized market, there's not as much open source happening. It's hard to sort of incentivize companies to come and share their designs and so on. It's not, you can't incentivize them quite that much as their global profits are incentivizing them. And the manufacturing scheme has been a bit cold. There has been some success in bringing assembly, testing, manufacture, and packaging of semiconductors to India, because people are looking for alternatives to China to do this. But again, this is a relatively low value thing to be doing in the supply chain. But there has been some success, not very much. At the moment, it seems that the government is waiting and watching to see what happens with this technology. If it's really going to be such a huge value add, like the end value add of AI itself. And perhaps that is actually a good thing to do at this moment when you're thinking of investing a lot of public money into the manufacturing of the picks and shovels, as it were. I'll quickly go through the other elements of AI sovereignty and enablers. Connectivity, I've written it very casually, and it seems fine, doesn't it? It's not fine. There's like definitely access issues, and there's like discrimination, and women don't really have as much access as men. There's regional differences, there's rural-urban differences. But India did have an explosion of internet access in the last few years, and this has been very bad for the telecom market in India, but there is access, and there is potential for more access. Electricity is an extremely thorny sector politically because that there is some cross-subsidization going on in India in terms of electricity, which is necessary in that urban consumers subsidize rural consumers of electricity, and by rural consumers is meant agricultural uses of electricity. So it is difficult to touch that sector to bring changes, and perhaps that is also for the best, because some of the attempts that have happened to bring changes to this sector earlier to sort of reform it and to centralize it entirely and to deregulate, to privatize the electricity sector have been met with profound failure. So, this is a problem if India decides to be like a hub for data centers or that sort of thing. Something will have to be figured out. But I think it's interesting that electricity has so much democratic engagement in India as a sector. But yeah, education and talent is, India is in an interesting place because there's so many of the best AI engineers in the world come from India. And there are government policies that are quite comprehensive, at least there are plans to sort of like bring in more AI education in India and, have it be very directed and have all of these like top IITs or Indian institutes of information technology run these hubs for AI education. But I feel like there ought to be more strategic thinking about whether, what this education is directed towards, both in terms of sort of, do you just want to follow what is happening in the world in terms of LLMs? Okay, if the world is doing LLMs, OpenAI is doing this sort of model, should we also be working on exactly those models and compete with them in that immediate market? Or do you want to be broadening your focus in AI or digital technologies in general, as well as I don't think there is enough thinking about the retention of talent in India, which is of course hard to do as a government. You're not going to be like, no, you can't go outside. But there needs to be a little more thinking about this is a strategic advantage for this country and how do you take advantage of this. In terms of cybersecurity, there is a national cybersecurity policy, but it hasn't necessarily been implemented. And the India AI mission, quite concerningly, does not really talk about cybersecurity. So, but the policy that exists has been drafted directly under the Prime Minister's office. So there is some focus on it, but I don't think that these goals are meshing in terms of the AI policy and the cybersecurity policy. So some broad takeaways, I think India does care about sovereignty. It has a long history of caring about sovereignty, both because it likes to have a strategic autonomy and the history of the non-aligned movement and the brand confidence, and it has all of these things in its as its legacy. So it's hard for any government to not care about sovereignty in India, but perhaps a more textured understanding is necessary. So compute, it's easy to do and easy to think of and think like, okay, we don't want to be reliant on this really concentrated supply chain of compute that is, outside of the country. We don't do much here, and so we should build domestically. And this is a very straightforward story to tell, and it's important to think about it. But I think of sovereignty as having two components, one being independence and the other being democracy. And I think India has done incredible work in the first component of independence, where it doesn't get actually enough credit. We keep talking about India and DPI, but I still think India doesn't get enough credit for thinking about independence in the tech sector in that way. But democracy, in terms of the solutions that technology is put to, is still missing. So, you're just thinking of, well, there is AI and you should use it in education, you should use it in agriculture. And this sort of thinking of tech solutionism that we keep talking about is still rampant, even though like ed tech as a sector has really imploded in India. So no one's taking a step back and thinking of, well, if we really want sovereignty, what are we doing with it? Sovereignty should also mean protection of your country from hype cycles, from misuse and from the overuse of AI, in terms of how financial sovereignty also means that you're protected from global sort of monetary flows that can have like these destructive cycles. So India was, relatively protected from the 2008 crash. That type of thinking is required even in technology, I think. I think the current decision to wait and watch about what happens with the technology is this type of decision. It's really good. And I think the question of talent is a huge one that is waiting to be solved. Yeah, those are my overall takeaways.
This is very good. Actually, there is something that is very interesting to analyze, that India is benefiting a lot, also in terms of growth, from the rivalry between US and China. There's actually a lot of investments that are now directed to India because companies that have been persuaded by the US government to reduce investment in China and directed them to an alternative like India.
Yeah, so, I think this is the story, but I don't know if this is the reality. I don't know that India has actually been able to take advantage of this. It's the story India tells itself. But like the data-wise, China just happens to be so efficient in terms of their manufacturing. So
no, I think my understanding is that in part is, of course, the policies that have been enacted have had an impact, but that is a good added benefit from geopolitics that helps.
Yeah, it helps. Yeah, objectively, it helps, and it's waiting to be used.
Yeah.
If I could comment on that real quick, I think the biggest beneficiary of this so-called friendshoring phenomenon has been Mexico, which is right next door to the US, or countries that are more allies. Because India, in a way, the flip side, India is strongly non-aligned, and that actually means that it's harder for it to harvest many of these benefits, because if the US is viewing this from a very geopolitical national security lens, then it's more likely to at least the high value manufacturing or technology
kind of industries is going to want to move to countries that it feels are more like direct allies, for example. So there's some friendshoring, but it's more complicated.
Yeah, I agree, but I think like under the previous government, at least the image has been that it's in reality, the government was quite friendly to the US, and there was no danger of it saying, no, we won't, like do this or do that. Some foreign policy issues, yeah, of course, can't change in US-Russia policy overnight. But I also think that like it's the US government wants one thing, but US companies don't always follow through with those decisions because of just profit and efficiency considerations. And India is not really able to provide that competitive manufacturing environment so far.
And just what you're saying, that is the comment. I think it's two different types of investment, because I think that India is benefiting from companies that are either US companies or companies that supply to US companies that have divested a little bit of the investment from China to India. But what you say about Mexico is more, I would say that it's more about Chinese investment. A lot of Chinese investment of companies that are Chinese are barred from directly supplying US or allies, and so they exploit the free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the US to invest in Mexico, and at least as long as Donald Trump is not the president, and we renegotiate this in 2 years to produce there and avoid sanctions or problems that, I mean, we can speak more about this later, but I think it's two different types of investment.
I understand what you're saying, but I think it's not quite like that because those countries manufacture in China to export back to the US or American companies. But
yeah,
we will have a very interesting conversation about this, but I don't want to steal any more time from. Well, thank you very much, Kai. And now we move from Asia to Africa, and we have the pleasure of having Nombulelo Lekota here with us. Nombulelo, the floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about the South African state of the implementation of artificial intelligence. And as you said, we've already moved from China and India, but in South Africa, we are already on the path to get there. So there are four things that I'm going to talk about. Is the state of AI development, looking at the SA mapping and the as analysis, I'll call that. The next one is about the lack and concerns about specific AI legislation and regulations in South Africa, and also the slow progress of implementing the National AI Plan. So the National AI Plan was actually approved last week, the end of May 2024. So it's quite interesting to say that there was a draft plan in place, but in terms of moving forward, what has been done. Okay, taking all the various pillars, I'm just going to talk about current state of the National AI Strategy. Like I said, the AI strategy was approved recently. However, there was a Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which we call the PC4IR, which was established in 2019. This was the reflection program of our President Ramaphosa. And the recommendations that came out of there was the alignment with technology, invention and innovation, peoples and skills, infrastructure, resources, and natural environment, economic growth and inclusivity, and stakeholder relations and governance. So as you can see, coming out of the recommendations that were done in 2019, they are fully aligned with what is actually happening globally. Okay. Part of the recommendations that came out of the National AI Strategy was the establishment of the governance framework, which is still fairly new as well. Okay, also aligning AI with national development priorities. As you know, South Africa is well aligned to the UN's strategic development plans. So we need to make sure that all the SDGs, whatever we're doing in the country, is well aligned, and also address the ethical and regulation consideration, which is something also fairly new, but it's something that the country is currently working on, and also foster collaboration and stakeholder engagement. As you can see, China and India already are quite ahead. So instead, in terms of fostering collaborations within academia, private sector, and the public sector, that is also happening and following what other countries are already doing. So far progress to date regarding the National AI Strategy and AI Institute of South Africa has been established under the Department of Communication and Technology, and also the Center for Artificial Intelligence Research, which is sitting under the Ministry of Digital Economy and Innovation. Okay, so those are two separate entities. However, their work is more or less the same. And this is one of the challenges when I talk about the implementation, is all the various institutions of structures that have been set up, but there isn't any collaboration between them, or full integration. The draft national plan, like I indicated, is now has been commissioned and is implemented. Not implemented yet. It was actually commissioned May 2024. And the funding is provided under the Ministry of Communication and Digital Technology. Whereas in other instances, you find that the ministry responsible for any framework that is set up, the ministry then becomes responsible for the funding. Then that's another issue, okay? Because you may find that if funding doesn't come from one central unit, it becomes an issue in terms of implementation of the slogans. On that, stakeholder engagement, I spoke about that. The current legislations which really talk to artificial intelligence are the Electronic Communication and Transaction Act, which was passed in 2002, quite old. Some of those legislations needs to be updated to ensure that they include the requirements of AI. Protection of Personal Information Act 2013, and the Cybercrime Act, which was passed now in 2020. In terms of data progress to date, again, the Ministry of Communication and Digital Technology is responsible for ensuring that data classification standards and practices are in place. The data classification policy has just also been revised in approved in Parliament. So some of those things are still being implemented. R&D, innovation, funding also, that is managed by the Universal Service and Access Agency of South Africa. That is sitting under the Ministry of DCDT, Communication and Digital Technology. I spoke about the National Data and Cloud Policy, which was endorsed again in Parliament recently. Okay, the data classification policy was there before, but they had to include the cloud computing as well, because it's something fairly new in the country. The legislations, the Promotion of Access to Information Act and the Protection Digital Property Act, as my colleague mentioned, that is quite aligned to the GDPR. And also we have the information regulator in South Africa that oversees and enforces compliance with the acts. Again, there is continuous collaboration with various stakeholders, especially when it comes to data, small and medium enterprises. That's where the development of technologies are happening, and that's the academia is also involved, and private entities are quite involved as well. We have the the scientific services, in South Africa, CSIR, that is really, that is involved in ensuring that technologies, there's research technologies and also providing high computing powers to the various entities if they want to use that. The public and private data centers, we have the Amazon Web Services, as you all know, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure. T-Systems is one of the South African companies, as well as the State Information Technology Agency. So all those data centers are housed by various companies, and also depending on the type of data that is available, that can be accessed. The issue at the moment is the definition of data. What is a data? What is data? So the various organizations or the various private and public institutions, there's still discussions around the classification of data, because the minute you start legislating data, what is it that you just legislating at what point? You know, is it at input level or a generation level, or an output level, whether it's at the information itself. So currently the public data, I'm just want to talk about the public data. It's sitting in all of those. It hasn't been clear defined to say for Amazon that Web Services will be responsible there. However, the data architecture, which is sitting under the State Information Technology Agency, it's one of the things that they are also looking at to say, when we deploy technologies within the public sector, we have to follow the architecture frameworks that have been decided, whether it's what we call the government-wide enterprise architecture, or we follow other standards as well. So that can be applicable in all the public sectors where they have to implement the systems. Algorithms, the AI Institute of South Africa, it has been mandated to oversee the function, even though at the moment there hasn't been full implementation of data and algorithms. The public sector is still fully reliant on technologies that come from various countries. Our own State Information Technology Agency is also battling with the skills to ensure that they implement data or AI technologies effectively. Open source technology, open source software policy was developed in 2006 and still need to be reviewed, and also sitting under the State Information Technology Agency. And then the public sector, like I said, it uses a mix of proprietary and open source technology software. At the moment, there isn't any specific policy or rules on AI procurement, although researchers are already talking about that to say we need to come up with a procurement policy, especially that's sitting under the Department of State Innovation and Technology. Computing capacity value, still responsibility of the Department of Communication and Digital Technologies and the CSIR, the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, because they provide high computing power for various organizations to test their technologies, even though there hasn't been a clear mandate in terms of what is it that they're supposed to do, because something very, very new. However, they are still doing some of the testing, especially with academia departments. Connectivity and infrastructure. Yes, as you know that you also require infrastructure to support the current computing power. We have the National Research Education Network of South Africa, called South African NREN, which is sitting within the CSIR that provides connectivity and is funded by the CSIR. And also there's a state-owned telecoms company, Broadband in Franco, is also responsible for providing long-distance network infrastructure within South Africa. If I can take one back, Sunbrand also looks at the connectivity and the cables, water cables, you know, to make sure that there is available bandwidth within the country. However, there is again no clear national connectivity strategy that is in place. So as you can see, as South Africa, we're trying, we are coming up with research. However, there is still gaps here and there, and also in terms of implementation. Electricity and infrastructure. We have Eskom being a state-owned and primary power producer in South Africa, and we're having challenges at the moment, you know, in terms of availability of power. There's instances where there is power shortages, outages, what we call load shedding, sometimes 2 hours without power. Although there's you know, solar and generation power, that's also some of the private companies are assisting with that. Coal still remains the primary source of electricity production in South Africa. As you can see, the stats there say Eskom is providing 95% of the country's electricity need, and then we have coal at 84%, and then we have solar, thermal, and solar photovoltaic generation at 4.2%. That is still becoming an issue because the policy still needs to be revised in terms of what is it that we can do, how do we generate power and provide it to the entire nation, including supporting the AI infrastructure. So we have the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, NERSA, which is the regulatory body, and which was established under National Regulator Act of 2004. And then also the South African National Energy Development Institute Summit, which was also established in 2011. As again, I mentioned that the various bodies within or entities within the country that are doing more or less the same duplication of work. So it becomes an issue when it comes to implementation of some of the work that we see that. The legislations, especially under the electricity infrastructure, we have the Electricity Regulation Act, the Gas Act, and the Petroleum Act. Quite old, and some of these need to be reviewed. In fact, they are under review. Yes, like I said, the last bullet to say the current electricity bill is being revised to address the energy supply challenges of the country. Talent, education, talent promotion, and retention. The Presidential Commission of 4IR actually indicated that there is a need to make sure that we have digital skills within the country. The digital skills strategy and futures, the digital and future skills strategy, which was passed in 2020, has been commissioned, and some of the entities are, ensuring that we have enough skills in the country. Although there is still a shortage of that, we don't have AI scientists or digital technologies, the funding is currently being provided by Universal Access and Service Fund. There's a Digital Development Fund and the Unemployment Insurance Fund, Enterprise Development, Skills Development. Again, this is another issue where you have different entities providing funding for digital skills and retention, not retention, but skills. The issue is more again about, do all these entities have the same goal in terms of understanding what is required, what the country requires? So this just shows that we do have some of these good initiatives in place, but at the end, it's all about how they do things again, sure that moving forward. There's a public and private collaborations. The Department of Basic and Higher Education is also involved in ensuring that there's improvement in the skills and digital skills in the lower education level and higher. Universities, training institutions are involved. Department of Labor is also involved. Trade unions. And also the National Economic Development and Labor Council Network. One of the critical things that, as part of the analysis that I had to look at, was the digital literacy rate in South Africa. So as you can see, maybe from your slide here, it's just looking at the various education or various disciplines within IT. We have architecture and built environment, computer, information science, mathematics, statistics, and engineering. And as you can see from the slide there has been a drop in terms of ensuring that we do have graduates from the 4 disciplines, so that they can be able to gather the required skill and be able to implement what is required. So looking at the diagram doesn't look good, but when it comes to ensuring that, especially 2022, as you can see, that there's been a dropout effect. Female numbers actually increasing in 2022. Now we have more females who can now actually we've graduated in some of those disciplines, which is very, very important, because I think that if we have more women in those disciplines, some work will be done. That's my take on that. Okay. The other thing that I just need to highlight is that the 24 public universities in South Africa offer bachelor's and master's degrees on or coursework on artificial intelligence and research work. So this is something very good that's happening. There's also what we call Inkamba National Skills Institute that is established at the Durban University of Technology that provides digital skills training for teachers, and which is actually very good. Although we still have a shortage of AI skills, but looking at what the universities are doing, so that will help them getting more students or getting information skills in that. On cybersecurity, that's my area of interest. I love cybersecurity, but I'm just going to touch a bit on that. There is a national cybersecurity policy framework, which was passed in 2015. The framework allows the establishment of various cybersecurity structures within the country. We also have the National Cybersecurity Hub, so at the university, the National Cybersecurity Hub, which is responsible for incident responses. We for at national level, while at local level, there's still various institutions that have been set up, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. However, when it comes to AI, that's still a new area altogether that the country needs to look at, especially when it comes to how do we secure the data, from controversial attacks, and ensuring that all the systems are secure. What's the best practice frameworks to have in place. The state security at the moment oversees the effectiveness of the Cybercrime Act, which was passed in 2022, as well as the Department of Science and Innovation that's responsible for the implementation of the National Cybersecurity Research and Development Agenda. So there's a lot that's still being done within the country, especially when it comes to research and development. The issue is still more on the implementation side. This slide looks at the national cybersecurity entities that have been established. I'm not going to go into details. That, as you can see, the state security We also have the Department of Defense and Military Veterans, and also the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development also involved. And all these entities are funded by the respective ministries. Risk-based approach is something fairly new. At the moment, we only have the risk management framework that has been developed under the Department of National Treasury. And the framework only looks at the management of the Public Finance Act and the Municipal Finance Management Act. However, when we look at the review of all these acts, especially when we need to talk about data, we need to talk about technologies, all these acts need to be reviewed. Okay. DPI also something fairly new. We have the Center for High Performance Computing that's sitting under CSIR. The strategy is still not clear in terms of what they are doing, but they do have the infrastructure that they're providing. So it's one of the things that with further research, we're able to understand what is required and also how can they enable, the running of the AI infrastructure within the country. Last two slides. Concerns about lack of AI legislation and regulations. This is one of the things that that is really a concern. South Africa, like I said, is still starting with the implementation of the policies, but if we don't look at the current acts, for example, the ECT Act, the Copy Act, and CyberBRICS Act, because those can lay the ground, the foundation, the groundwork for governing AI and other technologies. That's very, very essential. We also need to look at AI legislation and regulation to oversee the ethical use of AI and also to provide guidelines and oversight, which are critical to prevent AI misuse and unintended consequences. In the absence of that, AI-focused laws can be then challenges to hold developers and deployers and users accountable, especially when it comes to undermining transparency and responsible development. Something that we still battling to do. But what's also important that the lack of legal and regulatory framework could hinder investment and advancement of AI solutions in the country. I mentioned that there are various entities that are funding the development of AI technologies within the country. However, we need one legislation and regulation framework that will govern how it's done. And lastly, slow progress in implementing the national AI plan that could result in missed opportunity to position South Africa in the BRICS AI landscape. Because I think it's still, one of those countries that they have potential in implementing, but we still behind when it comes to that. But it's, we don't want to miss that opportunity. There's also the impact on the country's economic competitiveness. The AI Institute of South Africa and the Center of Artificial Intelligence, the establishment of both units, that has delayed. That will have an impact on us missing the opportunity to become part of the BRICS landscape, and also the allocation of significant financial and human resources, very, very important. It's something that we look at. And then also addressing the gaps in AI-related regulations and legislation. Yes, that's.
A very detailed overview of the South African landscape. I'm sure there will be questions. In the interest of time, also, I would switch to the last presentation by Viviane so that we have then time for 10 minutes of questions. I'm sure there will be questions. It's also interesting to see that in the national policy, the South African policy, I was reading it a couple of days ago, that was published last week. There is explicit mention to data sovereignty, at least in a couple of sections. It's mentioned even in terms of use of data for national development, which is very interesting. It's one of the very few policies that explicitly uses the terms data sovereignty to speak about national policy. Please, Viviane, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here to hear the video's presentation. So I present the AI sovereignty in the BRICS. It's a Brazilian mapping, and it comes from my experience in system and science computing. And then after reading the work from the FGV law school, I was able to study AI sovereignty in a proper way, as how we can get there. To understand how this AI sovereignty refers to a national interest.
Esse aqui é do lado, né? Do lado. É do lado.
I think you should click on the slide. It's not on the right window. No, with the mouse. Click once with the mouse on the slide, then there we go. It'll work now.
Yeah. Okay. So what is this AI sovereignty? AI sovereignty, why is it relevant to a nation? Right? It's relevant to a nation, national sovereignty, because in the context of digital transformation, it relates to the use of AI systems. It's related to the use of this artificial intelligence to support this cyber-physical society. The message that I brought is about this cyber-physical world that is changing after this digital transformation. So AI sovereignty is about understanding this cyber-physical world. So AI sovereignty is the capacity of a given country to understand the AI systems while retaining control, agency, and ultimately self-determination over such systems. It's about using it and gaining value from this usage. This sentence is from Luca, and it's really interesting when we say that we have to understand the AI systems. We have to understand where this intelligence comes from. So related to regulations in the BRICS countries, we have an opportunity to study digital transformation and the systems adoption of technologies. And it's a really interesting opportunity to elaborate and to research, because the countries are still implementing their digital strategies. So it's a great opportunity to develop not only digitalization strategies, but cybersecurity strategies to protect the cyber physical world. And that what I bring to you now is about this cyber physical world and this new society is related to a paradigm that is used in the field of science and technology. It's a paradigm of Internet of Everything. A paradigm that is well known and came from the Internet of Things of our daily life that is connected to the Internet. So we have more and more data and intelligence that is brought from this data, and we are generating data in this cyber physical society. And as everything is connected to the Internet, things are able to generate data to sense the world and to change information and make intelligent decisions, regardless of human intention. So there are autonomous things in this world. And we can think about that people are consumers of the Internet and of this data, but they are producers. We are always producing data. And the Internet of Everything with cyber physical society knows everything about us. They don't know where we are, what we are doing, almost what we are thinking. They're trying to understand and to imagine what we are thinking. And they are always trying to suggest actions. So this algorithm, these things, this data are always trying to make us do things, buy things, and go and to live what they are supposed to suggest what we should do. And all of this is about process of intelligence service. So it's not only about artificial intelligence. It's about using this intelligence to give value, to use it well. How can we use it? Our intelligence, on behalf of AI sovereignty of a nation, and we use it well. We can support the risks, but it's a great opportunity for growth, for society growth, as soon as the society knows these enablers. There's data, exponential data, things connect to the internet, autonomous things, machines, algorithms, and people as sensors and actuators, as intelligent sensors, and as not so intelligent sensors. So we are always being sensed in our daily lives, even though if I'm not connected to the internet, I'm a human being that are right here, and I can be sensed by sensors that are widespread in this cyber-physical world. So this paradigm that was studied before, for me in my thesis, was Internet of Everything it requires a knowledge-based approach. A knowledge-based approach to understand this intelligence that goes through this cyber-physical world. And until now, we still don't realize the value that we can gain from this new society. So AI sovereignty is not different from digital sovereignty or digital transformation. It's just a way to gain value from the use of these intelligences. So it was really interesting to connect the sovereignty, as Luca defined it, the sovereignty, artificial intelligence sovereignty enablers. So how can we get there? But first we have to know what it is, and then we'll get there. So I studied the enablers for IOE paradigm. So it's about knowledge, and knowledge from people, from the algorithms, and from the data that is stored in database. And we have how this data is structured and organized, and we have to trust this system. It's really important. Can we trust it? And as soon as I can trust it, can I deal with it, with this risk? So I have to know where does this data, this knowledge came from. I have to be in awareness of it. And this outcome and action is about transformations. Why do I have to use it? So any application, AI application or AI system is about knowledge, type of sensors and how they are presented and how they are used, if they are human or human, cyber physical, how they are engaged to this system. So it's what, who, where, when, what am I observing, and when is it real-time observation, and the end, how can I support this? It's about capabilities. It's about information technology. It's about using the technology to support this outcome here and this action, to support this knowledge here. As soon as I have the knowledge, I don't need the artificial intelligence to do that. As soon as I can process the amount of information that is in the system, I need to have an artificial intelligence. I need to have a way to process the amount of exponential information. So I decided to organize this cyber-physical world. And then I saw that there's a way to get there to AI sovereignty when we put this thing all together. So AI strategy, I brought this picture from Gartner. So it's related to private application of the AI, but it's about a vision and why we need to get there. It's about sovereignty, and we have to realize the value of using this AI and using this intelligence, and then we have to measure the risks. Is it worth to go there, analyze the risk, and then we go for the adoption, and then we go to analyze how much will it cost us and the risks associated. And then when we think about vision and risks and adoption, we can get away from that hype cycle of AI technology. Everybody wants to get there, but then can we use it? Do we need this? Is it related to a vision, to a country vision? So let's move to Brazilian regulation and strategy that is still going on. We have the Brazilian artificial intelligence strategy that says that AI systems must be robust, safe, and secure throughout their life cycles and must assess the potential risks. It's true, we must always be thinking about the potential risks throughout the life cycle. And then they define access for the legislation, regulations, AI governance, and international aspects that we are studying on our CyberBRICS mapping. And there are a lot of vertical axes related to capabilities and labor, developing the workforce, and the application of technology, the public sector, and public security. So the cyberspace is this virtual space and all forms of network and digital activities. And when we think of the cyberspace, we think of all actions, human and automated actions, conducted through the cyber physical environment. So when we think about actions, we can realize that actions that are derived from this relation. So when I do something, and we can think about decision engineering is a field of analyzing the decision that is made from artificial intelligence related to human intelligence and the actions that come from it. So it's in the aim of cyberspace responsibilities. So cybersecurity is the collection of two forces security concepts used to protect this cyberspace, to protect all these actions, these relations, to protect humans in the cyberspace, and to protect all the cyber physical environment. And I think it's important to provide a common ground. In Brazil, we have the information security glossary that defines all these terms, and I think it's we have the good definitions to provide this common ground. And cybersecurity is no doubt a major concern for BRICS countries, and we need a strategic approach to develop AI skilled workforce, and it's about education, training, capability development, and mostly this digitally literate society is the society that knows this AI system, its components, and where does this knowledge came from, what intelligence it is, what are the risks, and then we have especially important is the critical infrastructures that supports the cyber physical environment. And critical information structures are all the structures that supports the virtual or physical assets in this environment. So we define that critical national infrastructure as infrastructure that can cause social, economic, political, and international impacts on the security and function of the society. And Brazil has specific plans for critical infrastructures regulation. So to support the use of AI and AI sovereignty, we are mapping and studying this AI sovereignty, key AI enablers of sovereignty that was defined by Luca Belli. And now it's really comprehensive about what we should do to get to this sovereignty that realize the vision of a country. That is data governance, is to identify and protect the data and to guarantee that we have data and the quality of this data, to know what data we have, a nation has, and what we don't have, and protect this data as a resource. The algorithm governance, to know the implicit knowledge that is in this algorithm and how this algorithm can influence the result of the use of this intelligence, computational capacity and connectivity, electrical power to support this connectivity and computation capacity. And we have to educate the population and to gain awareness about this cyber physical world, and a solid cyber security. And we are going there, and we see that Brazil is developing this cyber security policy. So in 2018, the National Information Security Policy was published, and that policy defined that as a national information security strategy, we should divide this information security in thematic modules: cybersecurity, cyber defense, and critical infrastructure, and so on. But this was and then the cybersecurity strategy was developed. And I guess, and I really don't know, that due to the digital transformation and importance of the field and the protection, this item was revoked, and Brazil has now its a specific national cybersecurity policy. And this policy is dealing with risk management, it is dealing with protecting the AI sovereignty and protecting the nation interested in this field. And the national cybersecurity policy established that there is a policy which representatives of distinct sectors of the society can contribute to develop these policy programs and strategy. So the principles of these political cybersecurity politicals are national sovereignty and the prioritization of national interests. It's different from the principle of the information security policy. And then the objective is to guarantee the confidentiality, integrity, authenticity of the information and the solutions. So it's specific for cybersecurity strategy. So what you can see in mapping Brazil regulations and strategies, we have a myriad of documents, strategies, and regulations. And in my opinion, as I see, it's important to support a regulatory framework to organize these strategies, these policies, what to do, and then this strategy, how we can do this in fields, in areas related to data, cybersecurity, and digital transformation. And we have federal development strategy. We have a national digital governance strategy related to digital government. We have the Brazilian digital transformation strategy, the Brazilian artificial intelligence strategy, and everything that comes from the AI regulation. In the field of cybersecurity, we have a national information security policy, the national cybersecurity policy that is revising the cybersecurity strategy. We have the Brazilian strategy for fifth generation networks related to connections, Marco Civil da Internet, a law for internet regulation. We have the National Internet of Things Plan, regulates that Internet of Things, that realize the Internet of Everything connection. We have National Innovation Policy that deals with innovation. The degree for governance and data sharing, because the public entity has a great work to do inside to organize the data, to support the quality of data before sharing it, before integrating it. So the degree of governance and data sharing define the national data infrastructure and actions to interoperability and to data sharing and data governance. We have the General Personal Data Protection Law, Open Government Policy related to open data policy, digital transformation plans related to a specific domain area. So we have a myriad of strategies, and I think that with the security, the cybersecurity policy as this defining that as its main objective is to protect sovereignty and national interests and protecting the cyber physical environment would lead to an organization and to awareness about the cyber physical world and how can we manage these risks associated with risks. And thank you.
Also for a very detailed presentation, and very good to have this connection also between sovereignty and the cybersecurity part. All right, should we have 10 minutes of questions and comments, maybe even 15 if we can, and then 5 minutes to go to the toilet, to run to the toilet, have water, and then get into the regulation part. Questions, comments? Yes.
Yeah, thanks everyone. So, building on Luca's stack or areas, I'm not sure, what it would be. That's, I guess one thing I
Can you just speak a little
Yeah.
louder so the
yeah, sure. Building on Luca's stack and your areas for AI systems. What I guess I didn't see in that list was the way in which firms or organizations are captured and forced into using models that come from other countries. So thinking about how, say, Microsoft Office bundles in certain kinds of models and doesn't really give you ways to lock in other models, or how when you start to use one model, you might build a set of standards around it and you sort of expect certain outputs, and switching to another one becomes really hard. We've seen some laws try to deal with parts of this, but not really in this exactly. And it talks to the link maybe between AI and the rest of the software stack, and the rest of other normal pieces of software which you would expect AI systems to be integrated in. No matter how much you build national compute, net neutrality, and so on, if your software that is in front of you with the functionality you use for non-AI things forces you to use AI services from a certain provider in another jurisdiction, that's not going to be very great for like an AI sovereignty approach. So how much in, both in your framework, but also in the countries in the CyberBRICS project, is it considered, have you considered, or have policies nationally considered how one product or area or domain forces you to use products, areas of domain in AI from another space or in other digital technologies?
I mean, I don't think we talk specifically about, we didn't talk about it, but we've studied specifically about governments and whether they have rules about using open source software for just government functioning. But I know you're talking more broadly about, and I don't think we've studied the relationship specifically between unbundling and antitrust and sovereignty. I think that's a good point. We've studied, some of us have studied it separately, just like, antitrust and AI, but like, I think this is a good point that these are related things. You can't have AI sovereignty without some manual of conduct.
I think that, but as long as it's connected to the internet, like, as long as certain capability, only written from data, that interaction, these applications should be considered, an application should be considered cyber sensor. It's an application connected to the internet, able to retain data, able to do an algorithm in this network, so it's connected to the internet. It's related to AI, related to use of intelligence. It's not part of it. So we have to be aware of the applications about this sensor, this smart sensor, this sensor that are not so smart, temperature sensors are connected to the internet, so they are part of this place. So we can support cybernetic system that is apart from the network, but as soon as this application is the internet related to AI and should be indexed, the document that I'm writing should be indexed later, now or later. It's there, it's covered. I think it's important to realize this vision of information technology, the use of technology. So that's why it's.
Yeah, I think for my presentation, I think I touched briefly on the architecture, because that's really, when you talk about not understanding the state of technology. So the State Information Technology Agency, is the one that's responsible for implementing what we call the government-wide enterprise architecture. It because within that architecture stack and technology stack, then we're able to see which other technologies can plug into them. I know in terms of the entire mapping, it didn't really come out clear, but that's where the role of the architecture framework becomes very important because then that cuts across the whole entire.
Yeah, well, I wanted to add something. I think, well, in this case, yeah, I think for the investments made by the Chinese government in recent years is actually to realize the total independence of China vis-a-vis of the kind of the chips and the semiconductor products from the USA. But still, I think there is still quite a lot of the shortage of AI talents in China, even though we have truly made huge progress in producing those software. But I think now there is truly a decoupling due to the mutual distrust between China and the USA. China is putting quite a lot of money into this. I believe that we can actually probably to be totally independent. This is a big priority for China in the next few years.
And we just add this, yeah, and I think there are two things that actually we are finalizing a paper on data sovereignty, and we were precisely looking at this. And I think there are two strategies. The first one is through policy and the fact that you have to localize. The only way to escape the being forced by a specific product or service to use cloud infrastructure in another jurisdiction and then losing all the control that you may have on it is to localize data. And some countries like China or to some extent India for sensitive data, or Russia for a lot of data, almost all personal data in Russia had to be localized in the Russian territory. In that case, if you oblige localization, then you cannot be forced by another company to export data if they are obliged to localize data in your country. But of course, these are like huge costs, and it is highly ineffective. It may even be insecure, because if you are obliged to have data in a specific jurisdiction, you cannot replicate them in different servers, then you are less secure. I mean, you may be more, you can have more control on it, but you are not more secure, because if that specific server is attacked, then you lose access to data. But the problem, and I think that only in this moment, China and to some extent Russia are able to solve the problem, that if you localize, you need to have infrastructure. You cannot, that is the problem, that is what Brazil is thinking now in terms of escaping dependency. If tomorrow was taken a law obliging everyone to localize data and in prohibiting Microsoft or Google to oblige individual or chat or OpenAI to oblige individual users to process their data in foreign jurisdiction, then what would be the alternative? Even if you had to use, you cannot build servers that allows you to have the computing power that Microsoft Azure, AWS, and Google Cloud provides you in 2 days. It takes decades to not only build them, but also have people trained to maintain them. I'm speaking about alternatives, right? Not, of course, in Brazil, we already have a lot of Google and other Microsoft Azure and AWS servers, but they are the same. I mean, then the data, either you prohibit to replicate data in other servers. So one, have to have policies. Two, need to have infrastructure, and it costs a lot, not only to build, but also to maintain. And even so, you are not necessarily having the most secure option. So either you go Chinese and you have an intranet, a national digital ecosystem that is somehow autonomous, ideally in their vision, independent from the rest, or otherwise, so far is still an open research question for us in the project to understand which is the best possible option to have retain control on data while having at the same time a resilient and an economically efficient option.
I think it's missing one point there, which is that looking at Apple and Microsoft in particular, investing very heavily in local processing. so that we make the consumers or the businesses pay for the hardware, pay for the machine learning chips, run the electricity, and then deploy machine learning systems onto your Mac. So Apple Ajax model, then Microsoft entire new brand of computers. The data localization laws don't affect that at all and don't provide any sovereignty over that whatsoever.
So your suggestion is to have basically embed processing in the
That's what companies are doing in order to not to reduce their cloud costs, but to maintain capture over the entire market. So data localization laws won't affect that whatsoever.
Yeah, but okay, but I see what you mean, but but this works very well for the company. But how this would solve I mean, how would you see this from the government perspective?
That's the point. It works very well for the company.
Exactly. No, I'm saying, I mean, this is very good for the company to sort of hijack the globalization policies. But then so you are mentioning this not as an a governmental policy, but as a response. Yes.
Even before localization policy, it's a pre-response.
Yeah.
Because of that.
I'd like to actually just question to what extent sovereignty is possible within this space. Because even, for example, in an environment like China, I have a lot of mainland Chinese friends who extensively use Western products. And, it's a bit of a hassle to use a VPN or whatever solution, but all these things are accessible. And the China can't really kind of regulate Facebook, for example, or can't regulate these entities which are already banned from their markets. Like there is no Facebook in China. And so it can't stop its citizens from accessing these services, and it has no control over the entity that provides these services. The only entity so far that has shown an ability to control, for example, Facebook would be the EU and the US through their regulations. And in some instances, when kind of large markets where these companies operate, like India and perhaps like Southeast Asia, band together around specific content issues, perhaps, then they are able to influence these large corporations. So there seems, at least to me, from my perspective, to be a just inherent lack of individual nation sovereignty or like a possibility for that, given the fact that these technologies inherently are kind of porous, they can be accessed. We can't really stop use of them. And so I think rather than focusing on individual nation sovereignty, in a way, perhaps the only productive thing we can do is by going, one step further abstract and kind of working together in like large groupings, as long as you're not the US, the EU, and perhaps China.
Just contextualize. I mean, our goal of the research, neither of the research nor of the concept is to advocate for separation and national intranets. On the contrary, is to advocate for cooperation while not being dependent. So the question of the sovereignty is not to say, let's all build digital walls and stay in our countries. Absolutely not that the issue of the research. Is to say, let's avoid being totally dependent from choices taken by others. So our goal in research is not to say, let's study how we can build our own national internet ecosystems, but it's say, let's study which kind of policies can be used to avoid being totally dependent and victim of other companies or countries' choices, right?
True, but people will use other countries' choices or services that are impacted by other countries' choices.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so in a way, you kind of have to negotiate and work together with them in some sense, while of course promoting local capabilities.
Yeah.
Like that bit I understand.
Yeah, but again, the goal is really to be able to promote the development and the regulation of the technology. The local development, understanding development and regulation of technology, not necessarily the exclusion or the others, but having multiple options. So that, let's say, if, for example, some peculiar figure is elected as a president of a specific country and decides to ban the use of specific software in another country, you are not screwed, but you have an alternative. And it's also in terms of, so we will have an event of digital sovereignty on the 19th of the next month, precisely to speak about also the weaponization of technology and also how economic sovereignty connects with digital sovereignty, precisely to highlight that digital sovereignty is not about being independent, but being autonomous. It's like, I mean, if you
if you know about internet architecture, there are a lot of autonomous systems that work together. It's not about being independent, having your own system, but being able to connect with the system that you want on your own terms without necessarily being subject to other systems' decision.
It's a question of predominance rather than access. So, Facebook's not predominant in China. This is a qualitative difference because, for instance, Facebook can tell Australia, if you force us to share revenue with these media companies, we're media companies. This is a problem for Australia. We have to think about this and we consider their policy or at least negotiate it. This is not a problem for China when they try to regulate their own companies from the US. So, because it's a question of having options if a company decides to leave. But having said that, I do agree that it's important, like sovereignty is not enough. You need countries to band together to, fight capital that is so mobile and that can just be. So I think it's important that we do this BRICS work as, is there a joint BRICS understanding of sovereignty also?
Yeah, I think that this is a big question. I also want to come to the definition by Luca about this sovereignty thing. For Facebook, actually, if you live in China, you must need a VPN to get access to that. But actually, I think that the sovereignty, it should mean that we if this company decides not to stay inside your country, you still have options to, for instance, to have your own version of Facebook, of for instance, of Twitter or things like that, or the Zoom. But another thing I wanted to see, I really like this idea of this weaponization of the technology because, I want to give you an example of Huawei. Because Huawei is highly suspected to spying for the interests of the Chinese government. But actually, when the American government tries to check whether there are loopholes behind the Huawei, they actually don't find any problem with the Huawei technology, but they still ban it. So I think that whether these national security concerns really exist or is it really a pretext for excluding the other countries' companies from their market. I think that here the sovereignty really matters because you must protect the interest of your companies, your digital companies operating overseas. I think this is also a sovereignty thing.
And honestly, for the Huawei, I think it's a good case of how actually Brazil had a very good example, sovereign choice at the end of 2020. We had here delegations from the Department of Commerce of the not here but in Brasilia lobbying for the Clean Network Initiative and offering subsidies to ditch Huawei, not to have it as an equipment provider. The telecom regulators had a very good solution, which is not to say, let's go Chinese or US, also because China is our main trade partner, as all Latin American countries and African countries. But the choice was to say, well, let's adopt our own regulation that imposes very high cybersecurity standard for the telecom sector, and every single operator or equipment provider that meets this high bar of cybersecurity standard is welcome here. For the national, for the governmental network for 5G was created, was taken a specific choice where the government can choose whatever provider they want. And for that network at the time, the Bolsonaro administration decided not to use Huawei, but for the rest of the country, all the operators can choose the provider they want. Also because Huawei is 10% cheaper than the other two main players, that are Ericsson and Nokia, which have they have similar level of quality, but 10% or 15% higher prices. So it's very difficult to say to your operators, let's ditch this one, which is much cheaper, because the US don't like it.
But it's an interesting comparison because you can say ditch Huawei and stop them 100% using Huawei. But my point with these technologies is you can't stop people from using.
No, yeah, but my example was to say that having that I using this as an example of sovereign decision in terms of keep your options open. It was not sovereign in the sense of block someone, but keep them all open according to your own rules. That is the point. The vision that I think we are trying to lobby for here is not being sovereign in the sense of cutting bridges with others, but being able to understand how the things work, so that you either develop your own choice or you set the rules. It's, I mean, it was, if you want, I think I'm sure you will see it now with the regulation panel, what the Europe tries to do in terms of setting your own rules. Maybe I think that the failure of Europe in this moment is that is not able to develop technology and not even maybe to understand it very well. And I mean, this reconnects a lot with AI transparency. I mean, there are very few examples of centers or regulators that understand how AI systems work. And even with high standard of transparency now imposed, I'm very skeptical that there will be a dramatic improvement in this, but I very much look forward to the next panel to learn more. And I think, yes, the last word.
I would like to challenge that you cannot stop people. You can in all the ways that matter. For instance, India banned TikTok and hardly anyone from India accesses TikTok because content creation is an economic activity. And if your audience is not able to easily access your content, you're not going to stay on the platform. Everyone's moved to Instagram. So, you know, in all the ways that matter, India has banned TikTok and it's not a player in the Indian market. And so, sure, some people might be able to access it. It's pretty meaningless, economically speaking.
Instagram is the real same.
That's right? But you can actually stop people from using it, using a certain platform. Maybe it's not a good choice.
All right. Now, I think this conversation could easily go for another couple of hours, but we have 1 hour and a half left to have several presentations. So my suggestion is that for those who want to go to the toilet or have a cup of water, there is water here and toilets here. And then in 5 minutes, we start the next panel, all right?
Did you sit at the computer?
Acho que não está deixando só.
Mas ele pegou o e-mail dele primeiro.
Nossa, teve onde vocês estão vendo?
Tá, o João ainda tá com a função errada, só que ele volta.
Eu nem falo no lugar, então pode.
Pode,
AI regulations in the plural. So the idea is that we try to think not only on the regulation that is taking place, but also on alternatives that we might consider. So before anything, I'd like just to express how happy I am to be here with you all, because if we realize we are here with experts from all over the country, all over the globe. So it's really impressive that we've managed to get all of you to be here with us this afternoon. So with that being said, let's start with Michael's presentation. Michael Veal from the University College London.
I wasn't sure of the order, so. Yeah, sharing, find whatever the screen, put buttons on Adobe these days.
Everything's already ready.
There we go. So it's not F11. They changed, used to be F11 to the months. Very bad.
Hyper efficient.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I just want to get a block with the fixed information about stay. Which narrow time, so we have it for everyone.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Okay, thanks everyone. So I wanted to walk through, there's a few things I could have talked about today from different angles. I was going to talk about how actually everything is moving on device and data is not relevant anymore. If you wanted me to talk about that, yeah, I can talk about that later on or and break some afterwards because data is actually not important and everyone's got everything wrong about that. But instead, I want to talk about some work I did recently with Rob Galwa and Kira Mattis. Rob's at Berlin Social Science Center and Kira is at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. This is a paper in the annual review of law and social science. And we talk topics around it. And we were asked to write about AI and global governance, provide a guide and a primer to what this is. And maybe they were going thinking that it's the kind of the UN's going to be involved. The UN is not involved, there's no UN at all. Actually, what global governance of AI looks like is a lot more like a complex mesh network of private governance, platform actors, and so on. We wanted to give an introduction and a flavor to that, but there's actually a lot more you can say. So looking at where we find governance of AI, some people are thinking about what do we do with these models, make them, run them, not. And this room is not thinking just like that, as we've seen from the first 5 presentations. In this work, we look at development, use, and infrastructures of AI. As all being very important here. And AI is understood broadly as a practice, it's sort of a business practice, an applied area of science and technology. AI is not a thing, it is not a tool, it is not an object, it is often a way of configuring and reconfiguring the world as well. So governance of AI development, you might be putting requirements during the design of systems and the maintenance of them. If you're deploying use, might be during the deployment stage of these. And if you're looking at infrastructure, this is actually a kind of policy that's transcending this development use dichotomy, drawing attention to integrated technology stacks that are often transnational. So Luca mentioned net neutrality earlier on. These kind of areas are exactly the kind of transversal infrastructural elements that do determine important factors and that can't be classified into development or into use, but provide the conditions for the deployment and the development efforts. So we looked at these 6 areas. There are more that we could look at. We were only given a small amount of space, but I wanted to run through them quickly. We find that globally, we find ethics codes and councils have emerged within companies particularly. There are internal ones to companies. Microsoft, IBM, Google have several. Many of them have exploded or imploded in a variety of different exciting ways. And there are also external bodies, often due to industry funding, things like the Partnership on AI, the World Economic Forum, whatever that is, and financially supported research entities like the Future of Life Institute or the Future of Humanity Institute that are themselves posing or putting themselves as bodies for the analysis of these things. Bodies for the analysis of these issues. We find industry governance occurring as well. Not private regulation, private governance is not new. The whole history of the internet digital technologies has largely been private regulation, often with co-regulation or state in the shadow of the state or multiple states, and state regulation directly in in a positive manner in digital technologies is fairly recent in many types of software, not every type, but often it's been kind of arm's length and doing things like providing liability shielding rather than positive obligations. And when we look at industry governance as emerged, the first part we kind of find is issues around fairness, bias, and transparency. Many of you earlier in the week were at the ACM Fact Conference, one of the places where some of the technical work on this was born. And it's a very convenient area for industry as well, because it allows them to say, oh, we are being very responsible because we've made tools and deploying tools for certain fairly narrow purposes, which are wholly unthreatening to the underlying platform business model of many AI players. And so we find these tools have effectively managerialized some areas, and they've been accused of shallow and decontextualized engineer and lab-centric methods for dealing with what are complex socio-technical issues around power. And particularly when we look transnationally, these do not really concern power transnationally, nor do they deal with issues of fairness and discrimination in different national contexts, because largely they're taking from a very US-focused paradigm of racial discrimination in a US context, when we know that around the world we have discrimination and segregation and stratification in many, many different intersectional ways that are culturally very different than the US, but are nonetheless very important. Those are layered on with an ignorance of these contexts by global technology players who don't see the markets as important to engage with or designed for, and therefore many countries that have quite complex national issues of segregation or discrimination or equality or fairness, furthermore find that they are just sold tools that don't really deal with those issues or help them deal with them. We also find API bottlenecks and AI as a service, the conditions of use. So we say you can't use our service unless you do or do not do certain kinds of things. This kind of private governance and ordering is also a way of moving liability and responsibility around. OpenAI have APIs like this, General Azure or Google will have APIs like this. They may or may not be policed. We find some licensing requirements as well on open models, which I'll talk about in a bit. So the general question is still in the air about what a responsibility of a so-called general purpose model provider is in this whole software stack. And generally they want to not take this responsibility. We find that some intermediaries in this space also are facing content moderation challenges. A paper from Rob Golder and me this year called Moderating Model Marketplaces looks specifically at this issue and looks at how private governance is very important in other areas of the AI space. Now this links to challenges around contracts and licensing. So what we do see is when people create open models, they will declare some copyright over it, and they might let people use those models, but under certain conditions. Those of you who have a history of background in copyright will know about copyleft licensing. This is where you force people to reuse your code in a way that is open. You have to publish it as a result. But in the AI space, we find an increasing use of behavioral use licensing that says, we've made an open model. You can only use this model or republish it or change and fine tune it if you use it for certain purposes or do not use it for certain purposes. These can be very broad, like no law enforcement, no medical advice, no fully automated decisions, no exploitation. And these are very open-ended terms that are hard to define, but they are hard to enforce as well, because typically only the rights holder is able to enforce those. However, we find platforms like GitHub and Hugging Face may be taking new moves, Hugging Face in particular, to enforce these licenses for people or take down things on the basis of this license. So you find a lot of outsourcing of governance going on here into quite a complicated space, which is not actually particularly efficient or effective, and is compounded by the fact it's not really clear how IP rights actually apply to lots of parts of AI models, and so it's not clear you can hang licenses on them. And nor is it clear in many legal systems that you can actually make a license that is as complicated as this. Open source licenses have been challenged for their validity in many legal systems already. Standards are very political, and that's where a lot of energy is occurring. Standards have many, many different roles in governance and regulation. Interoperability is a core thing in normal technology standards. And for those of you who have dealt with those, who come from the digital space, We had discussions of Internet of Things standards, for example, where of course interoperability is really maybe the only thing that area really needs as a core foundation to offer, because without that, nothing will function at all. If nobody is talking the same language, then these data sensors are useless. So that's one important role, but in AI, that's not what standards are really for. Like interoperability standards is much less important than qualitative standards. They have political dimensions, what can and cannot be produced or used by a model, what kind of restrictions might be there. They also signal best practice in the marketplace. They signal to legislators that certain laws are or are not possible or cannot be applied. And they also have signaling roles for courts in, say, tort and negligence claims. These typically empower incumbents because it takes a lot of money and effort to participate in standards bodies. They often come with limited accountabilities, particularly with national standards bodies, where you have to pay for the results of these. It's really a pay-to-play system. Less so for internet standards bodies, but they're a bit different as well. But the national standards bodies are becoming very important in regulation. So the EU AI Act leans heavily on national standards bodies to actually write the law, basically, because the law was more or less unwritten when it was passed. And the Commission do not believe that the law would work without a set of standards, at least the core part of the law. So they're hoping that it gets produced by standards bodies who have been given an impossible task for something that cannot actually be standardized. So there's a lot of tension going on here, kicking the can down the road for regulation further and further until it reaches the actual regulator who has to clean up this mess and won't have the capacity to do any of it because it will all be very, very, very unclear with moving of burdens of proof around the place and so on. We also see a parallel area that I've written about before, environmental standards and product standards like Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance. These work very differently, but they've actually been ignored here because we've built on networking standards and national standards, whereas the governance mechanisms of these are quite interesting and different. They're definitely not perfect, but they come maybe with more social dimensions in consideration. So international agreements, I don't want to cover this too much because it's not really my area of forte, but we do find that the preparatory documents by many international organizations hardly differ at all from industry ethical codes and therefore kind of add very little to the discussion. They almost always omit power, competition, ownership, or broad majority world questions. They don't touch on areas of sovereignty or the stack. And so these are pretty much all irrelevant for all purposes, I would say. Like really, they really will get to discuss things, but in terms of going further than what's happening, they're not making much discussion. Natalie's better place to talk at the Council of Europe, and probably will do it. You probably will do it, I imagine. So I will leave that to Natalie. Maybe not. If not, you can help go later on as well. Broadly, we see a clash with the EU product safety approach, and that was sort of had to be reconciled by taking out the private sector from the convention that's being proposed there. So you do find some tension. And also you've got summits, AI safety summits, some codes of conduct, more AI safety. It's all mostly noise at the moment that's used to, it's not got much behind it, I would say, and can be fairly safely ignored. Again, maybe not, you can pay attention, but it's interesting geopolitically, but in terms of actually linking to regulation and practice, there's not so much to grapple with that moves the needle, I would say. Now, lastly, converging and extraterritorial domestic regulation. This is still a bit EU-centric, sorry, but there are parallels in other countries I'll highlight. The EU AI Act, and of course, wherever the Brazilian AI Act are probably the two kind of most advanced in this space, and they do adopt more of a product safety style approach here, and so we see convergence there. It's a bit early to see any more convergence than that, but discussions are definitely happening there. The Platform Work Directive in the EU is a very interesting mode. Spain went with first as well to look at digital labor platforms, and that has algorithmic accountability regulation. We do see movements around governing platforming and digital economy, digital platform labor. Many countries are engaging in intermediary liability reforms of varying kinds. The Digital Services Act, the US is a total mess in this regard, but there are people trying to propose different things. The Supreme Court may be making different movements in the future. The UK Online Safety Bill, all these touch upon recommender systems, platforms, and many AI actors are platforms. So many things like Hugging Face, like Azure, and so on actually do have, they benefit from intermediary liability shields, and therefore them collapsing has a different role. Data protection, we find copyright, and so quasi-competition regimes like the Digital Markets Act. All of these are also important AI instruments for regulation. And we find these actually converging in their sort of flavors around the world in strands, and together to actually weave together a global governance regime for AI, much more than something called the AI Act does, I would say. Like, actually, these things together are kind of the meat of what's going on, whereas the AI Act can be a bit of a sideshow, because a lot of AI is just platforms and intermediaries and infrastructures. So paying attention to the regulation there is maybe more important. Last slide here, the tensions. Read about them in the paper, but broadly, it's really hard to govern things that span borders. Governance is often a form of lobbying to stop regulation or to signal that compliance with something different. Governance is about framing AI, where we find talking AI into being. AI doesn't really exist as in the way that many regulators or people think it does. It's not as advanced as people think it is. It's not able to have actually functionality that is useful for people in the way that people think it might be. It just looks very flashy at the moment because it's often optimized to look flashy. So talking into being by saying the thing you need to regulate is itself a way of driving market interests to give you a company that looks like it should be at the center and maybe even be like a state. Then you have to deal with it as an actor that should also have all the control of this thing. It's too dangerous to give to anybody else. And inappropriate AI centricity, when we actually are trying to solve problems of the digital world, we might want to look beyond just an AI toolkit. And of course, it's not quite global, a lot of what's going on. In fact, it's the opposite. So we really have to ask, who benefits from all of this? And this whole structure that's emerging, the moment it's not doing much to redistribute power and deal with those issues that we've seen before. So you can find the paper there, and just Google the name of it, or use any search engine of your choice. And yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Michael, for such a brilliant overview of a complex topic in a time that is so short. I'd like to highlight what you said about the AI centricity as opposed to human-centric AI, which is something that AI should be developed and thought by putting the human being in the center, not the other way around. In benefit of time, we will do like we did in the last panel and keep questions to the after all the presentations. And now I'd like to invite Marta to speak with us. Marta Ziosi from the Oxford Internet Institute will give us an overview on AI regulation.
Hi everyone, so it's Marta here. What I'm going to present today is very much work in progress. So I just wanted to hear all the ideas, also welcome feedback afterwards very much. And just to give a little introduction, the work I'm going to present is the development of a previous report where Lama also Lama contributed, and we compared the policy approaches of several countries. So the UK, the US, Canada, China, and the EU at the time. And we produced a report that compared them on several dimensions that, notwithstanding the change that these policies undergo all the time, they could remain a little bit more constant because they were generally not. Now we moved on and we'll be looking at different countries. So we'll be looking at Singapore, at Japan, at South Korea, and the last one is Brazil. Very important. So the
last but not least.
Last but not least, exactly. In fact, we have been mapping the policies of these different countries. As you might imagine, and as Filipe also knows, many of these policies are being shaped as we talk now today, especially with Brazil's. So take this with a pinch of salt. But let's say that we have compared these policies on three main dimensions that we think are generally enough to deserve a comparison. So one is their approach to risk. The other one is regulatory requirements. And the last one is monitoring and enforcement. So with regards to the approach to risk, we have Brazil and we have South Korea taking a more similar approach in certain ways in terms of like regarding to risk, they both define different level of risks. However, Brazil seems to be relying on multiple level of risks, so more similar to the EU and the EU AI Act On the other hand, it's that South Korea seems to rely on one main definition of high-risk AI systems, and that brings it closer a little bit to what is being discussed in Canada, so IDA, if that doesn't change as well, where they have AI high-impact systems that they define, and they have regulation falling down from there. So that's very much for Brazil and South Korea and their approaches to risk. Regarding Japan and Singapore, instead, they take a different approach at the moment. They take a more decentralized approach to risk, so closer to the US and the UK in a certain ways. In which way do I mean that? So risk is seen more as context dependent, more suitable to be assessed by sectoral regulators in many instances. Why? These countries share an emphasis on a coordinated and proportionate approach that balances risks with benefits. Especially Japan, for example, like stresses to be cautious against being overcautious on risks, not to hamper innovation. So that's very much the sort of approach to risk that is more innovation driven in many of these countries. Singapore, on the other hand, is unique in providing support to companies through what they call the AI Verified Toolkit. This is a sort of testing platform for governance, but also more on a technical level. You can think about what just came out in the UK in the AI Safety Institute. They just put out the open source platform AI Inspect. AI Verify would be that on a technical level, but not only, also to check, not to check compliance because it's soft law, but just to guide the following of guidelines basically for private companies. So that's very much regarding their approach to risk. Now, what about regulatory requirements? So while Brazil seems to go for an overarching hard law requirements and obligations for AI systems attached to different levels of risks, South Korea instead seems, again, closer to what is being discussed in Canada in IDA, where they really define, in fact, AI, high-risk AI systems, to which they attach several regulations. However, the requirements attached to high-risk AI systems are still lighter than what the EU AI Act attaches to high-risk AI systems. Other systems would just fall under self-regulation and government promulgated guidelines, such as soft law. Regarding Singapore and Japan, they both adopt an overarching approach to regulation. However, a very soft approach, no hard law. Japan complements it by an extensive revision of existing vertical law, for example, the Copyright Act and also the liability laws. And instead, Singapore accompanies and facilitates the following of soft regulatory guidelines through the AI Verified Toolkit, as previously mentioned. So that's very much for regulatory requirements. What about monitoring and enforcement? So on one hand, Brazil and South Korea might establish a new central authority for AI regulation, even though this is being discussed for Brazil. And while in Brazil, these details are being discussed, South Korea's AI committee will only be envisioned to have decision-making and deliberation powers, but not necessarily to have any enforcement kind of power. And in that sense, this is more similar potentially, or it's going to take a more similar approach to the UK, where enforcement is happening or might be happening at the vertical level. South Korea, in fact, does not at the moment envision any sanctions in case of non-compliance in its proposed AI Act bill. Japan and Singapore, in terms of enforcement, over there, enforcement is an exercise of self-governance from private companies at the moment. However, Singapore provides unique support to facilitate compliance through this AI Verify toolkit, while Japan is relying on a historical net of trust between the government and the private sector, in which compliance is expected, is implied. That's more of a characteristic of Japan. So that's very much it at the moment. Many of these things are changing as we speak, as we said. Some of the Brazil part will require some updates, but this is very much it. In the report, you will find more details, of course, but I'm very happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Marta, for this amazing overview of the report. It is still about to be published, but congratulate not only on you, but also on Lama for working on this really important effort, because for us, when we try to study the big picture of AI regulation in the world, is really helpful if we can start by such an instructive, informative document. So let's move now to Nathalie Smuha's presentation. She comes from the KU 11 University and the NYU.
Hey, thank you for the lovely invitation. I'm gonna go old school as well. I have no slides. And in the next 10-ish minutes, I want to talk about 4 points. The first point I want to discuss is challenges in regulating AI. Because I've been on the other side, as I discussed also with some of you at lunch, I've been on the policymaker side. And so I do have appreciation for difficult trade-offs they need to make when they govern AI. And I think those trade-offs are relevant for any country jurisdiction that is thinking about AI regulation. Second point I want to discuss is something that is often juxtaposed, the risk-based approach versus the rights-based approach to governing AI. I don't think we should see it as a strict separation, but I just will say a few words about it. Third, I will briefly say something about the AI Act. And then lastly, I'll talk about algorithmic rule by law, which is a new research that I'm doing. Okay, challenges to regulate AI. I think you know many of them, but I still think it makes sense to just take a moment and appreciate them. The moment you want to regulate something and you put it into a law, you have to define it. The moment you define something, you have to make it tangible, even though, as Michael already mentioned, it's not something that you can really point to. But you need to try anyway. And every definition will fall short in one way or another. And every definition will depend on what the actual purpose of your legislation is. And then there is this thing also known as the AI effect, where what we consider to be AI changes over time because we become so normalized to it. And you kind of essentialize a thing by putting it into a legislation. So, and that is a challenge because there are many definitions out there and you can criticize every single definition, I would say. Context matters, so that's another trade-off or challenge that you face. Are you going to regulate more on a horizontal level or more on a sectoral level? How do you take into account the fact that the very same technology, something like a deepfake technology, can be used to develop synthetic advertisement faces and nudes of women, of which there are also many websites? It's the same technology. So it becomes very difficult to know how do you deal with one purpose and make sure you can still keep the other. AI is also one of many technologies, and there is this thing like the AI hype, and we're all focusing on it. But one problematic side effect of having an AI-specific regulation is that you might push developers in developing other types of technology that don't fall under the AI definition, but that are just as harmful. And so that goes into the discussion of, do you want to have technology neutral regulation or AI specific regulation? And if it's going to be AI specific, you better come up with very good arguments. What makes AI different than a lot of other technologies or software in general? Because otherwise it shouldn't be the AI Act, it should be the Software Act, but it doesn't sound as sexy. And that is why it's the AI Act. And then what do you precisely regulate if you decide to regulate? Are you going to regulate the development process? Are you going to develop the actual system and its use? Are you going to regulate the output? Are you going to regulate the developers or the providers of the system? So there are lots of choices to be made there. And the AI Act kind of takes a let's do all approach. But you know, you can criticize again all of these choices, and well, not making a choice is also a choice, right? So you need to go somewhere. Now, these are AI-specific regulatory challenges, but there are also regulatory challenges in general, because legislation is a difficult thing, and every lawyer knows that, because laws will always be over and under inclusive. So the moment you put something out there, it's going to cover certain things that you actually didn't want to cover, and it might not cover things that you actually wanted to cover. And the AI Act, for instance, works with an exhaustive list of AI systems that are considered as high risk, but this exhaustive list has drawbacks, right? Because if you're not in the list, you're not being regulated. And of course, you can foresee some flexibility mechanisms, but there's a choice you need to make there.
The same is the choice between standards and rules. So for the non-lawyers in the room, or for those who just need a refresher, basically, standards are these more broader, principle-based, I want to say rules, but I can't say rules, norms, rather, that you should follow. Think of acting in a reasonable manner, or taking all state-of-the-art precautions. It's not very specific, it's not very precise, but it allows you to cover a lot of also future behavior. If the state-of-the-art changes, you're not specifying exactly what it is, but you force companies over time to adapt what their practice is. If you implement a rule, on the other hand, it's in principle way more precise. You're telling the company you should test for bias, you should do this, you should do that, but it's usually in a more limited way. And so there might again be things in there that don't fall under your rules, even though later on you realize actually that would have been good. We couldn't have foreseen it. So standards are broader. The problem with if you go broader is there is some vagueness, right? And there is more interpretative discretion. And a company can say, oh, that does not fall under the reasonableness standard. We were reasonable when we implemented these practices. And it becomes very litigious. So there's a trade-off to be made there. And I honestly cannot tell what the best thing is. Probably for different types of harms or different types of things, we want to work with different standards or rules. Another choice is between regulating ex ante or ex post. Right? Are we going to impose certain obligations on AI providers before they put their system on the market? Or are we only going to impose these obligations in general and then we control afterwards, only when something goes wrong, whether they actually abided by the regulation? And who will carry out the checks? Do they need to pass by a government and get a government's license before they can put their product on the market, such as we do, for instance, with medical devices? You can't just put any medical device on the market. You first need to have a licensing approval. Or do we just let them put things on the market and then afterwards, if there was a problem, we will figure it out, even though the harm already occurred and might be irreversible? Okay, big group of challenges. So that's why I have respect for the regulators that are making these choices. And again, not making a choice is also a choice. So you can criticize them either way. So let me now talk about these regulatory approaches, because we often talk about the fact that the European AI Act and many other regulations are risk-based. And sometimes it's juxtaposed to a rights-based approach. Now, they're not fully separate, but in a nutshell, a risk-based approach starts with this idea of you have to figure out which risk in society is acceptable and which not, because zero risk basically doesn't exist, right? So someone needs to make a choice of what are the kind of risks or which level of risks do we accept, do we want to have, and what are the risks that we don't. And it involves a cost-benefit analysis. At the core, it's something very utilitarian. You're going to try to look at what the benefits are, what the costs are if potential risks materialize, and then you're going to kind of measure them up. And based on that measurement, you can then have risk categories as well. And where again, the question is who decides on the risk categories, who decides on which risks are acceptable, and to which extent, who decides on the mitigation measures. Now we can juxtapose that to a rights-based approach where you don't really start with a cost-benefit analysis. Right? That is not how rights are balanced against each other. They can have tensions with each other, but you're not saying, well, look at all the benefits, so it's fine to violate someone's human dignity. It doesn't work like that. You don't trade off rights against benefits that are economic. So the logic there is a bit different. And sometimes the GDPR is seen as a more rights-based instrument than the AI Act, because there are clear rights there for data subjects, and you can't just put those rights away by pointing to the economic benefits. That's not entirely true, right? So it's not black and white. There are also trade-offs there that you can make. Think of certain legal bases where you take into account the interests of others as well, and there are trade-offs to be made between different rights. But grosso modo, there is something that doesn't really work there, that clashes. This is not to say that rights-based approaches are way easier. I can see benefits from it if you like human rights, but at the same time, human rights are complex social constructs. They're broad, they are messy, and they need to be balanced against each other because sometimes they can also enter into conflict. Now, the thing is that with human rights, over the decades, we have developed mechanisms to deal with rights balancing. This is what judges do on a day-to-day basis. So it's not a completely new thing. Yeah, so there are two approaches there, but the AI Act, and I think many types of legislation are kind of a mix. And most pieces of legislation will be a mix. Now, about the AI Act, so my third point. So the aim of the AI Act, I assume most of you are familiar with it. It's to protect fundamental rights, health, safety, and mostly to create a single internal market on the European Union so that AI developers and providers in France can export their products to Germany, to the Netherlands, without having any obstacles to the trade. And the reason why the emphasis lies mostly on the market rather than the fundamental rights is because of the way in which this regulation has been developed. It's a very market-oriented piece of regulation. In terms of what are we going to regulate, it's very clear product safety approach. AI is treated as a product, just like a dishwasher or a washing machine, and we're gonna make it safe by having some technical standards and fundamental rights, but we're just putting them into technical standards, and then you put a little CE mark on it, and you're good to go. You can put it on the market, and you self-assess. So these are, based on the challenges I put out, these are the choices that the EU regulator has made, for better or for worse. It's risk-based, right? And in terms of the standards versus principles approach, it's a very exhaustive list. It's an exhaustive list of prohibited categories, which you cannot change. There's also an exhaustive list of high-risk systems, which you can change if you update the annex over time, but there is a rigid procedure there, so it's not that easy. And there is an exhaustive list of systems that require transparency. So it's all very detailed. It's more rules rather than principles. And it has certain downsides, right? It can create more legal certainty for companies because they know, okay, this is the list. If I fall under it, I'm fine. If I don't follow it, I'm not fine. And on top of that, to make it even easier for AI providers, we have these standards that are going to make everything more interpretable. So as a provider, you can choose to either interpret the requirements imposed on high-risk systems yourself, or you can choose to implement standards that are currently being developed. The idea is that these standards are developed in a nice standardization organization where everyone is welcome to talk about how these standards should be interpreted. But in real life, basically only industry has the resources to participate in these things. So everyone is welcome, but not everyone is able to actually spend resources and time in it. So basically, it's industry choosing its own rules that it can then afterwards self-assess. So there are some issues with this. And then on top of that, if you implement a standard, there is a presumption of conformity with the AI Act. So that's going to make it even more difficult for you to prove that there has been a problem afterwards. There is a fundamental rights impact assessment obligation imposed on some deployers, mostly public sector. But it might become a ticking the box exercise because there will be just a template foreseen for it. Again, pros and cons, right? Because if you say, was it better not to have any impact assessment mechanism? You can criticize it either way. And then there's a very limited set of rights, basically two. You have a right to redress and a right not to be subjected to certain disciplines. But those kind of already existed in the GDPR, so it's not fundamentally new. Okay, I'm gonna set my critique of the AI aside and just close up with a final point. So one other part of research that I've been working on related to the AI Act is this concept called algorithmic rule by law. And there's actually a book coming out about that later this year. And I think this is something that is underappreciated in terms of how important it is. And it also links back to digital sovereignty. Basically, the rule of law, just to recap, from a democratic liberal perspective, the rule of law means that everyone is equal under the law. Everyone, including governments, must abide by the law. And the law is there to also protect the democratic process and human rights. Like the law has a protective function. Now, this can be juxtaposed to rule by law. You rule through the law, by the law. So their law is a mere formality, and law can actually be used to also undermine human rights. There are a lot of dictators or authoritarian parties out there that use the law to their advantage to actually limit the protection of the law of force, to limit human rights, to limit the democratic process. And one risk I see when especially governments use algorithmic systems to start implementing and executing the law is that you can have something called algorithmic rule by law. Algorithms can make it easier to use the law in this distorted manner because you have less accountability and less transparency, and under the guise of efficiency, these policies can be implemented. And these can be policies that undermine human rights. And we've seen already examples. Think of the Netherlands, the childcare benefit scandal, and there are many other examples also in other types of non-democratic societies where algorithmic systems can be used to undermine human rights and democracy. And well, it's election year with the rise of populism and authoritarian tendencies across the world. I think this is a very important topic. I think the AI Act does not address it. And I think no regulation on AI today or guideline actually addresses this risk. So I'm a bit concerned. And I feel so, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. Actually, I was planning on speaking as the last person, but I made so many comments on your presentation that I think it's better if I present mine now, so we don't waste our time here. So just letting the presentation, but before we start, I just like to start by saying that let me just check my point so I just start by saying that I'm talking here in a two-way perspective. A two-way perspective. The first perspective as an academic, and the second one as someone who has been part of the AI policy making when I was part of the Commission of Jurists who had drafted our AI bill, and that takes me to a very conflictive place in which it's hard to talk about this in a different perspective. But I'd like to start by making some comments on a couple of things that Nathalie mentioned. The first thing I'd like to get back to a Brazilian song. It is a Brazilian song by a deceased artist who's already left us for a couple of years ago, which was called Chorão. It would be like a big crier in the translation. And there was a very interesting song in which he says something like, for each choice, you have to let something go. So for each choice in life, there's something that you have to let go. When you choose something, you are at that moment leaving something behind. And that relates to what Nathalie was saying, because when we are trying to regulate AI, I think that we have too many questions, two first questions to answer, and that's something that we have faced when we were drafting our bill. The first one is a horizontal question. What to regulate? So are we regulating on children's rights and AI? Are we regulating, I don't know, environmental issues? What are we regulating? And the second step is a more vertical approach on, okay, we've decided what we are regulating, but how deep are we regulating? Are we just creating a bunch of principles, or are we getting hard law and making something more concrete? That is something that brings me to these tragic choices that Nathalie mentioned, the trade-offs that we have to make. And there's something that I would speak as somebody who has been there. Sometimes you have to make a couple of hard choices, not because you don't think that that's the best thing, but because that's what will get consensus and will be approved. Sometimes you have to make peace with something that is not the best choice, but maybe it's what will be approved at the end of the day. And when we are living in a no regulation, it's better to have at least some regulation than no regulation. So that is one of the things that is part of these hard choices that we have to make. You've also highlighted something about the problem of definition, because when you define in a very narrow and strict way AI, you leave everything else behind. And in Brazil, we've just had approved a very interesting bill, innovative one from our electoral superior court on deepfakes on elections. And something that I've been criticizing ever since it was published, that it brings a ban on deepfakes. That's one thing. But in other cases where it authorizes that you use AI, but you should disclose it, there is a problem there because they limit to AI. But we know that computer generated images, CGI, sometimes they are even more realistic than AI. So if we narrow down to AI, we might leave other important and concrete, dramatically harmful technologies behind. And that is something important as well. I'll just move to a timeline on the Brazilian scenario so we can all be on the same page. In Brazil, as Viviane already mentioned, we had, first of all, a Brazilian strategy on AI. It was called the BIA. It was considered really insufficient because it was not capable of creating a good strategy for Brazil. Brazil would rely on a set of principles that were not there to be enforced yet. When they were released, they were not concrete enough to be enforced. And that created a problem there because it was not clear on how to make this come true. And then there was the bill 21A20, which was approved in the Chamber of Deputies in 2021. It was approved in an emergency regime. That is something that we all tried to understand back then. Why are they rushing so much? Europe is trying to regulate this with several commissions. People are studying this stuff for a couple of years. Why is Brazil so desperate to have a new bill on AI? So that was the main thing. But it is easy to understand why they wanted to rush so much, because some might argue that it was a principle-based approach to AI. But others might say, and I do believe that's the case here, that it's not about a no principle-based approach, but a no regulation approach. It didn't regulate AI. It left everything else to companies. And that's why it was so, they weren't in a hurry to make this turn into law, because companies were really pleased that they wouldn't have no concrete obligations. And the most troublesome problem for me there, it didn't provide any rights. And we are talking about Brazil, a country where inequality is standard. Inequality is here. We have to face inequality and we have to fight inequality. And the bill was not capable of fighting inequality and all the problems related to that. Especially when we are talking about AI bias, discrimination. It was simply, it didn't consider the problem. So that was one of the main critics back then, that it didn't encompass and tackle this problem of discrimination. Then, with tons of criticism that came, when the bill arrived at the Federal Senate, the senator, the president of the Senate, this guy here, Rodrigo Pacheco, he decided to create a commission of justice, which I took part, and we were appointed to draft an AI bill from February, March to December of 2022. In that moment, we did something different. We stood there and we listened. We listened more than we talked. And the outcomes was the bill 2338, which was then introduced in May, last year's May. So 1 year back from now, what's changed? What's the situation? The senators have decided to create another temporary committee because the bill was criticized by stakeholders, especially companies, who said that it provided too many governance measures, governance rules that would make their companies, that would create a huge burden on their companies. So the senators decided to create another version of said bill, an updated version, and they are drafting it inside a temporary committee that was appointed last August, and it was due to release the latest version and vote last month, but they have postponed, and it's probably going to be published in the next few hours or on Monday. We don't know, it's unsure. But the thing is, they are updating the version. And why are they doing that? Because there were huge concerns from the private sector as to the amount of regulation that was being proposed by the law. So and that's something that we call here in Brazil, jabuticaba. I don't know if you are here in Brazil for the first time, if you have tried that. It's a small grapefruit that you can only find in Brazil. So it's something that we call a jabuticaba, is something that you can only find in Brazil. And for now, a jabuticaba is a risk-based and a rights-based approach. So for now, Brazil is one of the single countries in the world who are trying to create a bill on AI, which not only creates a risk-based, which is different from the UK's one. It is an excessive high risk and everything else, at least for now. We don't know what's going to happen in a few hours, but also a rights-based approach, because we face that Brazil has structural inequalities, biases, discrimination, and we have to tackle. So it's not just a mere set of principles. It is also concrete measures, concrete rights for us to tackle these problems that we have in society. But there's something that, and I conclude with that, Brazil is one of the first movers in the global south perspective, but there's a problem there. There's a problem there. Some might argue that Brazil, as being the chair of the G20, is trying to make its legacy from the G20 an AI bill. So again, they are rushing to approve a bill. There's not a consensus whether it will be approved or not. But the point is, it can't be the outcome of Brazil. Brazil shouldn't try to make legislation as its main goal. We have to impact in other ways, not only in how to create a legislation. We should impact in other ways. We should impact on how to develop AI sovereignty, as Luca and the others mentioned before, how to foster innovation, and that doesn't come only with a regulation. There are other ways of doing this to foster innovation and to make Brazil, in some ways, capable of developing technology, not in order to avoid being so dependent of other countries. And we've seen in the first panel all the problems that all this involves. So I think that global south countries are not developing AI, nor the legislation. Brazil, at least in terms of legislation, is being a little bit straightforward, but the problem is building and creating legislation for itself is not enough. We still have to work on building AI capacities, on building AI infrastructure, public digital infrastructures, for us to really achieve that sovereignty that was mentioned before. So with that, I close, and unfortunately, I can't give you any more details on that because it really depends on something that it's unclear right now as for the next steps. Thank you so much. So now let's move to Lama's presentation. Lama Saouma, is that our pronunciation name? Who is a responsible AI consultant and policy advisor.
Okay, so since we are at the end of the very long week, and all my fellow panelists did a very extensive job to cover every aspect of we could think of regulation, I decided to take a softer and more concise approach and just share some thoughts that might have been touched on indirectly, but I'll make a few points here. So the policy debate in end of 2022, early and throughout the 2023 was focused a lot on identifying the different actors of the development of AI and the value chain, and in particular, and defining the different requirements that might be feasible for these different actors. And in particular, the debate of what should upstream developers of models do versus downstream deployers and all the variety of terminologies that were used. So, and this, I could summarize like the main analysis behind the feasibility for these requirements across a few axes, which is maybe, you know, do you have access to the model? Do you have control over the model? Do you have access to the training data, control over it, and a few other aspects of development? And then do you have access to the documentation or like meaningful documentation of these aspects? Also, at the same time, with this development, especially over the past year, there was an explosion of the tooling that were developed to use these models. And in particular, I want to focus on few developments, which is, we heard a lot recently about AI agents, scaffolding techniques, and, you know, which, if I want to summarize it in a very simple way, ways for the AI models to call external services autonomously based on reading the prompt and using the results from these tools to complement it, like in their output. And this is just one aspect, but if we can extrapolate, this is giving more ways to connect, like increase interactions between systems in an autonomous way. And this, we can argue that will only increase the diffusion of risk, will decrease tractability of the risks and the effects of risks, will increase correlated risks and correlated failure, which we need to be considering more seriously when we're thinking of accountability. So the few points that I wanted to make is mainly like this, you know, in the research community, I think there has been more thinking around this topic, and there was a great paper at FACT this year. But I find like in the mainstream policy community, so mainly people that are thinking of current systems, and I'm excluding like the discussions in the Safety Institute and, you know, thinking of agents in other terms, like the more advanced and more capable systems. I'm really agents. I'm really thinking of this concept of autonomous interactions and connections. So I think the implications to policy mainly is that we want to consider this problem more seriously, and how we want to, how would that impact the requirements for these different actors. We might want to expand more the value chain to include these external use of tools, and also the connections between different AI agents or AI systems, or you want, whatever you want to call this, a subsystem that has some kind of intelligence or able to plan or do things in the world. And finally, I think that's more, that also has, that also touches on the other actors, like people developing infrastructure, and also the research community. We want to start thinking more of protocols to better track and mitigate the risks that arise from interacting systems. I'm sure we can think of a lot of parallels from the internet era, so I'm not gonna think this is something novel, but it will have more implications because of the autonomous and learning aspect. So yeah, we want to think of protocols. This ideally, we want to be able to develop more standards that are more agnostic, platform agnostic, because now we have a whole lot of agent tooling being developed by private and you know, machine learning operations platforms, but we want to try it. It might be good to think of independent protocols to manage this. This is a very high level. I'm going to end it here, but if might be like a good point for discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lama, for your remarks. Let's now move to our last presentation of the day with Andrés Calderon, who comes from the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru.
Right. Well, thank you again, Filipe and Luca for the invitation to join this beautiful panel. I'm doing here station visiting researcher stage. I just came to Brazil from last week, and the purpose of my research, my dissertation, is actually misinformation. So I'm gonna be talking about some points of touch between the problem of misinformation and AI. As I was talking to some of you during lunch, specifically, I'm dealing with misinformation fighting tools coming from the government, specifically fact-checking in the electoral context, which provides me with a great experience of what Brazil is nowadays doing, and with a more interesting focus on what the electoral tribunal is doing. But what I'm going to touch during these few minutes that I'm going to talk, having the last spot gives you an advantage to not have to address all the very interesting topics that you already made, but also gives me the responsibility of being short, so we can all take a rest before dinner. Is that one of the issues regarding possible regulation to artificial intelligence is whether misinformation is a specific problem regarding this specific use of technology or tool or whatever you want to call it, and if it deems necessary to address some of the concerns regarding misinformation in the regulation of AI. Three of the most discussed problems coming from misinformation with the use of AI are first, the possible increase of the quantity of misinformation coming from the less cost that comes with the utilization of AI to fabricate misinformation, to fabricate deepfakes, fake audios, and so on. This is what some people have called it the democratization of misinformation. The other issue that comes with AI and misinformation is the increase in the quality of the misinformation. Right, the problematic scenario in which people cannot distinguish typical misinformation that has been created by the use of AI. Finally, the other harm effect of the use of AI is the reduce of trust in traditional institutions like media or even democracy. So before going to one of the theories or discussions that I have on this, and I will be very welcome to hear your opinion also on the topic, is that I want to share with you some of the landscapes, the regulatory landscapes that are currently going on in Peru, where I come from, and in Chile, where I'm doing my PhD. So in July of 2023, allegedly Peru became, allegedly because I'm not sure if that is true, but became the first country to pass a law on AI. At least congressmen over there were very happy to announce that and say, okay, we are at the top of the world, we're ranking #1. And what does this law say? Pretty much nothing. It's like just 3 or 4 articles, some of them with definitions, not obligations, not principles, no risk-based approach. Like a couple of principles, not to be fair with them, mention the idea of having security standards based on risks, but not a specific standard, not a specific category of risks, and also the principle of ethical development in processing or putting in the market AI tools, and also privacy. The problem with passing such a fast law on this is that now the government, the executive branch, has the power to regulate it on the basis of those principles. And we are not sure what's gonna come out of it. There's a very preliminary draft on this regulation that follows very similar, it's very similar to the main provisions of, and the risk-based approach of the European AI Act. But still some criticism has been arised due to the lack of clarity on that regulation. In Chile, in May of this year, the government submitted to the Congress a bill, a very extensive bill that is quite similar to the European Act, that provides with more principles. They follow a risk-based approach. They categorize some unacceptable risks, some high risk, limited risks, some obligations depending on that of each category. And also, interesting enough, they they specifically give a rule of civil liability for the infringement of these principles. And also they have conferred the authority to supervise these obligations to the Data Protection Agency, which still not exist in Chile. So it says something like, there's another bill in which we will create a Data Protection Agency, and once that it is passed, that Data Protection Agency is gonna be in charge also of enforcing this AI law. In either of those countries, misinformation is a topic that is addressed by the AI bills or laws that have been passed. But I don't think that, at least initially, that is a problem. Because even though I do believe that misinformation can't augmentate the risk of or the quantity of misinformation or the quality of misinformation, and could also in some degree affect people's perception or trust in media, or at least in legacy media, or and democratic processes. The evidence that has been put forward by researchers regarding misinformation in general show that those dangers are focused on or are dependent on the consumption of misinformation, which is not something that we all at large, the mass population consume disinformation, or at least we do not consume more disinformation than we actually consume information. So, and even though even in the case that most people would consume disinformation, that does not actually mean that we all believe in what we are consuming. So there are several works that I'm pretty sure that you're familiar from, even the seminal work from Alcott and Gensko, also the work that Martens did for the European Commission, Nelson and Taneja, Fletcher in France, that show that people that are in the demand side of misinformation are basically small groups that are also very interested in the consumption of traditional news. So that doesn't mean that there isn't a problem, but probably what it means is that it is not that there is this new tool that can help to the creation and proliferation of disinformation that may not change the general landscape in which this problem needs to be addressed by the activity or the consequences that may cause, but not depending on the specific specificalities of that tool. Just to wrap up with these comments, I'm guessing that with the use of AI tools by legacy media, by governments, by institutional users, might come some not only criticism, but also the need to respond legally with some of the existing tools that we have, like liability, civil liability, or tort law, or consumer protection, or even if depending on the legal arrangements of every state, specific rules regarding misinformation, and that wouldn't require a new regulation that it's depending on the type of tool that it's being used to create that type of misinformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrés, for bringing us back to earth, because we were all saying about the abstract regulation of AI, and brought us a concrete example that leads us to our Q&A.
Fantastic. Questions, comments?
I actually have one, but I was one of the panelists. Can I ask?
Yes.
I think that's to Michael. So I started working on AI standards, and I agree with a lot of the things you said and a lot of the considerations. And you made a point that I thought was very interesting, that you said, tell me if I'm correct, that most standards that we're using or we're thinking of using for AI are based on like networking standards, and you're thinking instead more of environmental standards being potentially appropriate for AI. Can you elaborate on that? Might be on your paper, in your paper.
Yeah, it's in a different paper that wasn't on at the end by myself, Claire Mattis in Regulation and Governance, and 2022. It's called it's a learn lessons in sustainability, what machine learning standards. Yeah, broadly, it's just that the governance mechanisms that are in the standards and the digital standards body arose from governance mechanisms needed to make things interoperable, not things needed to negotiate human values. So when you have IoT standards and some of the people you brought into a room were the people who were like, oh, okay, like we should make sure that these the electrical protocol, the very low level stack works, the medium level stack. They might know from the industry that actually we use it in this way, that way. And these are all very valid because interoperability standards are effectively those that have output legitimacy. Either stuff interoperates or it doesn't. And if they work and stuff is interoperating well, it doesn't really matter so much how you got to that point. This is totally different than standards around any of the AI Act or in the Brazilian context or in any of these verticals, because of course it matters hugely who is at the table, what values are prioritized, and then that is saying how those trade-offs in human rights were made. So that's the kind of logic. And environmental standards have senates of stakeholders, they have like farmers they pay to come over and sit in representative functions and various other stuff that are there in the fair trade idea, and the governance is quite advanced. Not perfect by any means, because the transformative effect is a kind of consumer-driven one, but the governance is much more designed around like those labor struggles and similar things.
Can I make a comment on this? Because I think that, I think one has to make a distinction between two different conceptions of standard. Because one is technical standard, so technical specification, which is what you are speaking about. And then what Nathalie was also speaking about, that is standard as an appropriate level of, so an appropriate threshold, right? So, and I think that to clarify the discussion, it's useful to clarify this. So, what Nathalie was mentioning when she was speaking about standard was a norm that defines an appropriate level, but is vague enough not to cast in stone what are the specific options, which is what the technical standard would suggest.
The AI Act entirely relies on standards. Sorry, but the AI Act relies on the technical standards.
Exactly. So my point is precisely that. So there are two different conceptions here. What the AI Act adopts as for instance, I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, is Restos 61 of the AI Act, where say that technical standards are essential to prove compliance. And that is actually something that I've been using as an example of the fact that the AI bill in Brazil will be totally useless in my opinion, because it will be very easy, even if now companies are complaining about the fact that it's creating enormous regulatory burden for them, it will be very easy for them to skirt the application of it, because it's so far is filled with terms which is your conception of standard, like reasonable or adequate. And what we have seen with the Brazilian Data Protection Law, LGBT, which is filled with reasonable and adequate, is that it is very good as a regulatory strategy to utilize reasonable and adequate. If then you have a regulator or a standardization body that tells you what is reasonable and adequate. If you don't have this complement, it's a huge regulatory vulnerability, because you have the law that is made to be flexible, not to define an exhaustive list of options. But then if you don't know what is reasonable and adequate, if you're in good faith, you are lost, because you don't know how to comply with law. And if you're in bad faith, you simply say, I don't give a damn about the law, because nobody tells me what is reasonable. So what I'm suggesting is reasonable.
So the problem we get with the EU AI Act is you actually end up in a place between those two places, which is just hell. And which is called hell. It's called hell. This is what happens in hell. And it's what's happening now. The legislator says technical standards are arbitrary, basically. Goes to the private body, says make those standards. It is an impossible task. The private body goes, this is an impossible task. They say, but we need to do it because actually we get money from standards and our national standards bodies are all going bust. So we will take on the impossible task and pretend we can do it. But then you get to all the parts of the standard, which are like bias or human oversight or something, and they go, okay, we can't standardize this. It's impossible. So what we do instead is we leave it open-ended and we make an assessment. So we then say, to complete this part of the standard, we don't actually have anything much to say to you. You should go and look in your own context what bias means. Bring some stakeholders, write some documentation, here's a template, write it clearly. Okay, so that sounds okay, but it doesn't. You haven't actually ended up in the same place as your reasonableness question. So what they've done is they've embodied the part of the legislation into the standard. Now, if you go and try and enforce that as a regulator in the EU context, as Nathalie said, the standard gives you a presumption of conformity. But the presumption of conformity is through performing the assessment. It's not through having a substantive balancing that was appropriate or reasonable according to any legal standard. As long as you filled in a form, invited a stakeholder, made some balance that could form in anywhere there, the regulator cannot challenge you. So what you've done is you've laundered this reasonableness thing, which had a legal meaning, but maybe not the regulatory capacity to actually enforce it, or the capacity of the companies to do it. You've laundered it into a process where it's just a theatre. Because the regulator can now not challenge you because of that presumption without challenging the entire standard as a whole, which they will not do because they don't have the capacity to do that. So that's why you've been held, because
rather than having a technical specification, the standardization body finds a shortcut, ditches the responsibility, just rather than specifying what to do, creating a loophole.
Because the legislator gave them an impossible task to standardize.
Yeah, okay.
So
there are things but there are things for which I think don't even, I mean, a regulator would not be fit, right? Transparency. A regulator, it's very hard for a regulator to define what is meaningful transparency because they don't have technical stuff that understands how.
Standards bodies can't do it either.
I think it's easier to do to define criteria for which issues you should be transparent and how, in terms of which information you should provide and to which extent, so that it can be analyzed and even.
But that they put in an annex. there is a pretty annex which lists exactly which elements of information should be in the technical documentation, for instance.
Yeah, but exactly. So I think that this is an easier task to do than let's say, for instance, what is discrimination? Because that is something that a standardization body is simply not fit to do it. And so if they really need to do it, they will find a loophole.
And they found a loophole anyway in the transparency and so on, because the standards that they've been asked to reduce are horizontal, effectively. And that doesn't work because you have to have the same idea of transparency that makes sense in critical national infrastructure, like a maintenance robot for a train track versus a judicial decision support system, versus an education marketing system. Like, you cannot standardize those three things in the same standard for regulation transparency. So the horizontal nature of the regulation has torn apart this in a way that standardization is not just meaningless, but is a completely wrong, and forces the regulator to give everything the green light, because everyone has just danced around the assessment. If it was what they should have done, the correct way this should have played out is the standards body should have done what they do many times for other new legislative framework instruments like this, and said, we can standardize these parts, but we cannot standardize that, or that, or that. We reject the commission standardization mandate. Please revise it and give it back to us until you give us something that's standardized. But they are so hungry for money because the national standards bodies are really, really tight for money at the moment. They need people to buy the standards for the translations. And so they will accept really everything. And also people think they're heroes of their own story. So the whole thing is economically driven by the completely bonkers way in which standardization is being outsourced in order that the commission can say they're not delegating their powers under quite old EU case law.
But so I mean, follow your rationale. So the fact that they could standardize specific things, but they should have rejected other things. So those other things that they should have rejected. Which body do you think would be an appropriate body then to regulate them?
You could do it vertically, or the companies have to just interpret the law directly with the help of notified bodies, with the help of other agencies, and justify what they've done to the regulators. The burden of proof reverses to be on the company for those specific areas.
But then you need a regulator that is well staffed enough to understand it and to over that. I mean, that is, an infinite loophole, because it is. The problem we have here is that it's very, very eloquently explained by the recent creation of the Protection Authority. That it's very hard to have regulators that have sufficient financial and intellectual capacity to do something meaningful. So
There's no perfect solution.
no, of course, but this is why it's interesting conversation. It's very interesting conversation. I'm trying to build on what you are saying, because I'm really trying to understand which kind of model could be suitable.
What is the least worst outcomes? Are you willing to have more in the hands of potentially a badly staffed regulator who might maybe have more capacity in the future, versus already delegating more to industry and less oversight from the start and this presumption of conformity?
And all they're done on the cheap, right? Like they're doing all these sectors at once. Usually sectoral regulators have resources per sector. The AI Act is done in an incredibly cheap way. Like they're trying to effectively say a horizontal thing, add a few regulators in, give some capacity to additional ones. The Commission's impact assessment initially said, we think member states will have to hire between 1 and 25 people to enforce the AI Act, like each, depending on the member state side. Like if you do that, you're never going to enforce anything across these sectors. So I totally agree. The problem is you cannot, there is no shortcut to doing AI regulation on the cheap, because it covers all the sectors and it embodies a lot of the anxieties of society among contemporary transformations and other issues. So like you're in hell because we don't want to increase the capacity of regulators. If you go that way and you make someone do an open-ended frame, like analysis, AI requires you to do contextual open-ended analysis at some point in the chain. You either say, and you cannot do that on a generic level. It does not work if you give it a standards bodies. So you either give it to the regulated entity, or you kind of give it to the regulator through an investigatory approach, or you give it to a platform, but they don't want it because they want to sell things that are generic and provide no friction. So like, there are all of these kind of regulatory tools. Like, can we design it in, do it by design, or can we get a standard that does it for free? Can we just get it from heaven, like manna from heaven, and just apply it in a generic way? None of that stuff works for AI because you have to analyze everything in situ, and that takes people and intelligence and money.
But if we're in hell already, let me play devil's advocate. And so if we zoom out and look at like a longer time horizon, isn't the conceptual leap from what we have today to maybe a different approach, kind of shift to a different approach, or to increase staffing or increase resources much easier than going from nothing or delaying, or like, is it better to move a little bit fast and have an imperfect regulation and then iterate on it later, or?
But that is why I really appreciate, I mean, I think that in India or China, there is a different way of thinking in terms of regulation, which is to invest a lot of money into developing things rather than into doing a lot of laws and hoping that they will work. Because I think, and that is my huge criticism with the European approach, because Europe has built a factory of regulation that then the rest of the world exploits, because there is a lot of resources put them, and then it's the Brussels effect. It's a reflex of the resources that are put into building regulation, but then it doesn't put resources into building technology. Whereas there are countries like China or India, they put a lot of resources in building technology, and then they build the regulation when they are already sure that the values they want to embed into a technology, they're not necessarily democratic values, but the fact that they understand that they have people building it, and thousands, millions of people building technology and understanding how technology works, and they put money into developing it. Then the regulation allows you to steer how you develop it.
No,
not simply to react on how others develop.
it's not true, because what they do is they build platforms, right? They build platform models. Like India Sat, for example, is trying to copy the commercial platform model into a government level thing. It's trying to say, well, we can do something standardized or generic, but we'll make it generic, other people can build on it. The problem is the platform model is just as rotten, because it also is incapable of doing contextual in situ analysis. I'm saying the AI Act like promises to say when someone uses a risky technology, like it will be assessed properly, it will not have a problem on human rights. This requires you to be in the context where the decisions or whatever this system is doing are being made. And say, is this being done appropriately? Let's check. Who's it affecting? How's it affecting them? You know, what's happening in society when we use this kind of thing? That requires you to do something at a particular level. The country, India and China, when they are building a platform, the platform model has the same pathology as the standardization system, has the same distance for wanting to sell everything with almost no marginal cost. And you do not want to engage. Like when you go for the Indian e-commerce platform as part of India Stack, it also wants these e-commerce companies to go. It doesn't want you to have to call up the e-commerce company, the network, and say, oh, we actually have this feature and we'd like to talk to people to work out like how technology can work for us. It wants it to be seamless without any interaction and not tailored to the content.
I think it's generalization. I don't think I would agree with
These are different problems that they're trying to solve. I mean, India Stack and ONDC and all are not trying to solve like the problem of standardization.
No, but the logic is the same.
No, yeah, but they're not trying to solve this problem, right? Like you do different things to solve that problem. They're trying to solve a monopoly problem, which they are solving.
Yeah, they are, but they're replacing it with a platform logic, which is.
But I think you're
Like, you know, this is not, I think we're talking about different questions.
exactly. I think that you are. I mean, you are not. I mean, I think that when I was mentioning the fact that India and China put a lot of money into developing technology, you thought about digital public infrastructure, but I was not speaking about Aadhaar or UPI or this digital public infrastructure that India builds. I'm speaking about really concrete building factories for building projects, building software, not building digital public infrastructure.
Software is still deployed in a context.
Yeah, sure. But what I'm mentioning is the fact that you put huge investment, you fund the fact that you can build semiconductors, that you can build smartphones, that you can build software, that you can build AI, that you have data exchanges, these kind of things. I'm not speaking about the fact what you are saying. The platform logic that you are speaking of may apply well to UPI, to Aadhaar, to the open digital network, e-commerce network. Yes, you are right for this, but we are not speaking about the same thing.
I don't see then you were responding to, because if we were talking about in a regulatory framework around AI,
yeah.
Who bears the cost of making balancing judgments and making something specific to a context when you assess it?
Yeah, but I think you are speaking about similar things.
But we are speaking about that.
Okay, so if you're speaking about that, we can speak about that.
You said we like it because of investment, but then you replied that by saying we like it because there's a lot of investment in India and China, and then they make regulation later on. But no amount of investment solves the problem. Someone has to do that in situ analysis and balance.
All the challenges remain.
Yeah.
But if I take the perspective of the EU regulator, so what it would reply to you is, we are investing a lot as well. We also
Now,
have a dissemination.
Finally, now I'm very happy to see that over the past couple of years, at last, yes.
Strategy 2018, I remember I was there, we put into the strategy 20 billion per year. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, but in 2018, you started to think about this, which is very late.
At EU level, some member states were already doing it. Now, the EU is never going to catch up when it comes to consumer, but robotics, for instance, they're strong. So they will say, we are doing both. We care about fundamental rights, we care about regulation, and we are investing. And I was also thinking of the statement that you made on the hair and the heart. So if I would be an EU bureaucrat, which I'm not anymore, I would say our heart is fundamental rights and not AI. And so AI can be here because it's less important than fundamental rights. Of course, it's completely not like that. It's very hypocritical, but that is the reply that they would give. And it's something that does live with EU citizens. Like they see this as, okay, we are afraid of the technology, we see harm, and we understand that it's, useful to have this innovation and then to be able to build it, but we are able to build it. But on top of that, we care more about the fact that our rights and liberties are protected.
So something that, a quick reply to that from a global south, I know that is a very common narrative from EU bureaucrats that you are not anymore. And I've also already had conversation with EU officials telling them, I know it sounds very well, very good, but the only common characteristics of all global south countries are very diverse. Is that they are all former EU colonies, and until the 70s, France or Portugal were perpetrating the worst genocides and crimes in Africa, and so it's. I know it sounds very well. It's from a European perspective. Say we have human rights, and we have you have to buy your European values. Everyone loves European values, but people from the global south may say, yeah, but those values until a couple of decades ago were not so strong when you were colonizing us, looting us, and raping us. So that is I know it's very convincing amongst Europeans, but out of Europe, this narrative has limits.
And even within Europe, that's not how it functions, right? There is so much criticism on all of that. But this would be the narrative.
I want to see something about the hair and the heart.
It's taking personally.
The first thing is that you see, when you I totally agree with what Luca says about the human rights. Yeah, the European people, I studied in France for 7 years at Sciences Po. So the French students, I don't criticize anybody, okay? So this metaphor does not come from me personally. It's my interviewee who said that. Because I don't criticize the human rights thing. But the thing is that the Chinese policymakers, when you go to China, because we compare, so how much people use AI actually. So in what industrial factor does the European use? So how deep it is, the AI is deeply integrated into your industry. So this is the big concern. When you go to China, so you see the robots everywhere. You pay, you smile to pay, so the facial recognition, so you pay. When I go to the university, I don't use my card just to scan my face, then I enter into the university, enter into the building, into the bank. So I think the thing is that you must have the technology, then you have the object of regulation. If you don't have technology, what do you regulate? So that's the question.
But this is why I think the platform model is really important for them, because we know what we're not talking about is, so the university in China or the shop, how did they get this information? What is the process through which they implemented it? Like them themselves, not the country, the actual shop. Like what the shop does in these situations is there is a service provider. The service provider provides this out the box as a service, very arm's length. How customizable is this by the service provider, by the shop? Very little usually. Like the same as the university, very little. Like these things can sometimes, sometimes they're more or less interoperable, it depends. And that's because it's being adopted. AI is being adopted in these countries as a platform business model. When you have the AI platform, you have the local implementer of any AI system who has almost no autonomy to assess anything, to have any say over exactly how it should be implemented and how it works. Now that's a choice, right? I'm just saying that's a choice where you get mass technology adoption. And the way we know that gets mass technology adoption is it's the same logic as US companies have used technology adoption as well. The platform model where you say, roll out in a most generic way, homogenize the task, make sure that every entity who's trying to buy technology, the things they were doing before, which are all very different and messy, they're different filing systems, tell them, stop doing that, do everything in the same way using this tool. Everyone operates on Microsoft 365, and when you work on Teams. Teams look like this. They don't look like this. This is how you operate your company organization. And you start to make everyone's worlds homogeneous, then you can sell things to them. The question for the AI Act and similar kinds of regulation around that is, at the end point, when you're an organization, what wiggle room do you have to do the kind of balancing tests that Nathalie was talking about, to make the choices about how you balance off the way it works versus the context and so on. You have almost none in a platform model. You have de-skilling, because these are de-skilling. You have a homogenization of that task, which takes it away from the context. Now, what you could do is you could say, and this is the part where I get my argument about this, which is just, you could say, maybe we can bake human rights into the platform and say, that is where the trade-offs happen at scale. We can make the human rights balancing at that level and then propagate down to all of the actors in the space. I would say that's not possible because the nature of balancing has to be contextual, and that will make you fail in the balancing. And I think we see that with things like data protection by design, which don't work. We see all sort of by design regulation, which is exactly that mentality. Can we do it on the cheap through standardization or by design, applying it at the high level and hoping it trickles down? Works for interoperability.
There's no AI without platforms. Like it's no longer like the way AI is defined by the market is just through platforms.
Yeah.
So you can't have an AI act that is like outside of platforms.
Apart from weirdly we do, because the app basically doesn't mention platforms.
Yeah,
Would engage with it at all.
It trenches the platform form.
Yeah.
By not mentioning it.
Yeah.
And I think there is also a so there is an point that you are forgetting, and that's which is the reason why China has been developing enormously technologically over the past 30 years, which is competition. Because if you, I mean, the problem, I see the problem where, like in the case of Microsoft, where there is only Microsoft 365 as a software with Teams, there is only one. I mean, we are all the university of the world have been pushed into the one only platform. Where I might see the problem when you say India is using this platform logic because they want to build one only public platform, and so they are using the same logic. But in the case of China, it's really not like that. I mean, there are it's always a platform logic if you want, but there are multiple platforms competing to provide the best possible and cheapest possible service. So the reason why Soviet Union was able to send people on the moon, but there was no innovation because there was no competition. It was Soviet thinking. Everyone, it was exactly what you were saying. From top down, you have now this is the innovation and you have to use it. No one was using it because we had no benefit and no interest in implementing. In China, it's absolutely not like that. People are competing like hell internally because and so you don't have one platform. You may have like 5, 6, 7, and everyone is competing to give you something more for free and to give you a better service. So it's not it's always it's still a platform. I agree with it's not possible if you don't have a platform. You don't have AI. It's not possible to have to create an AI without a platform. But the problem is that I think it's wrong to think that there is one platform and that you will magically be able to bake human rights into it. You should make them compete for making human rights a criteria of winning the competition.
But data protection by design doesn't assume a monopoly either. None of the by design regulations do. I wasn't implying there was a monopoly.
No, the problem is that the customer, the data subject, if you want the customer, the data subject doesn't understand that data protection is a criteria of quality.
The hypothesis from your response, though, is that we could do that human rights kind of contextual balancing. If only we could choose from, say, 7 platforms, and one of them would have the correct balancing. And that's a hypothesis. And I don't think that hypothesis.
None of them may have it because none of them has the incentive to have it because.
It's not an incentive to provide it as a generic feature. It's because in order to do that, you have to be able to specify a problem, specify a system to the task you have. You have to say, in front of me, we are trying to achieve this. And we're going to do it, we're going to arrange ourselves in a way that achieves this and do this balance. The platform logic, whether you've got one platform or 10 platforms, always imposes the way of looking at the task. And so it de-skills the person organizing the task because it sells problem framing as a service. And I think that's the issue, where as soon as you have problem framing capacity at the lowest level, you are unable to do really very much at the lowest level in socio-technical systems. And I think we have lost that framing capacity, which is why universities, for example, no matter the fact they could theoretically choose Big Blue Button, Zoom, Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, all of these things, they actually can't say, we can't wake up and say, let's design like a course, like online in a totally different, rich way. Like, let's think about from the beginning, what would be a good education? And it's actually just not possible anymore. Like, it's really not possible. You hit to problems like UCL, like you cannot go back to a network infrastructure point. We had to set up a whole partnership with Alibaba. I could only use Microsoft Teams during the pandemic because nothing else was able to deliver around the world. Like, nothing else was able to deliver robustly to the students who are on the other side of the world because of the network issues around them. But you're just faced with like none of the building blocks are at your disposal.
Well, with this injection of optimism, I would suggest to declare this 4 very intense hours of debate, very enriching hours of debate concluded. I'm very happy, despite the marathon, because it rarely happens to me to be in a room with such brilliant people, everyone having such insightful ideas on something so interesting for me. So thank you very much. It's a present for me. I hope you also appreciate it. And also tonight we have an invitation, but not really an invitation because it's on your own expenses, but you are invited to come to have dinner at the yacht club that our friend Rodrigo is opening for you guys all. And I think we have 15 places, so if you are all invited to come if you want. And I've already shared details and indications. A round of applause for you all. Yes, we should.